There are things in the woods that no training manual, no survival guide, no tenured officer can prepare you for. I'm not talking about bears or mountain lions or even humans, though we're the most dangerous by far. I've been a U.S. park ranger for over 12 years. I've seen storms rip mountains apart like paper, leaving behind scars that bleed sap for months. I've pulled hikers from ravines where only bones should have been left, their screams still echoing in my nightmares. I've stumbled across things, half buried in moss, things with no name, no reason to exist, fragments of lives that ended in ways the coroner's reports could never explain. But none of it compares to what happened to me 5 years ago at the Whispering Shape Reserve in the shadow of Mount Sorrow's northern face. The locals used to call it different names: Screaming Pines, Devil's Breath Valley, the Listening Wood. Names that made tourists uncomfortable, so the Park Service sanitized it. But the old names, they knew something we chose to forget. This is a story I never told in my official report. You won't find it in any documentation or radio logs. Because if I told anyone what really happened out there in the Hollow of Echoes, beneath the watch of the morning sentinels, those ancient pines that locals swear weep blood at midnight, they would have called me insane, and maybe they'd be right. But you asked for the truth. So here it is. Just promise me one thing. If you're ever hiking deep in the woods, especially near places with names like Bone Creek or Widow's Ridge, and you hear a whistle but you're alone, don't look around. Don't try to find where it came from. Just walk fast. Don't run. Don't panic. And whatever you do, don't answer it. Because once you hear it echoing through the valley of forgotten voices, it already knows where you are. And it's been waiting so much longer than you could imagine. When I got transferred to the Whispering Shape Reserve in the heart of the Desolation Range, I thought it was a promotion. More solitude. Fewer weekend warriors clogging up trails with their Instagram poses and Bluetooth speakers. And most importantly, more time in the backcountry, alone with the trees and that perfect, terrible silence that only exists in places humans have barely touched. I was assigned to Sentry Point Station, the most remote outpost in the entire preserve. The locals called it the Last Light, a name that should have been my first warning. You had to take the Bone Trail, a crumbling fire road that snaked 14 miles through the Weeping Woods, then hike 3 more miles straight uphill through what the maps labeled as Devil's Staircase, a series of natural stone steps carved by some long-dead glacier. The trail markers were old, weathered things that looked more like grave markers than guidance posts. Each one bore warnings in multiple languages, but the English ones were enough to chill the blood. Travel in groups, and camping beyond this point, and most ominously, do not whistle or call out. But I didn't mind. That isolation was the point. That sense of being truly, utterly alone in a place where civilization was just a memory. My first week was uneventful. Routines, check-ins, scanning the horizon from my perch above the sorrowful valley for the telltale wisps of smoke that might signal disaster. The station itself was a sturdy thing, built into the living rock of Vigilance Peak like a medieval watchtower. I climbed the narrow iron stairs that had been worn smooth by decades of boots, brew a pot of scorched Ranger coffee on the ancient hot plate, and settle into my binoculars, waiting for something, anything, to break the monotony. The view was breathtaking and unsettling in equal measure. Below me stretched the Hollow of Echoes, a vast depression in the landscape where the oldest pines in the preserve grew. The trees there were massive ancient things that the forestry surveys called the Morning Sentinels, pines so old they predated European settlement, their bark black with age and their branches twisted into shapes that looked almost deliberate. And then one night, just past midnight, when the moon was dark and the stars seemed too distant to offer comfort, I heard it. A whistle. Clear, human, and just off-pitch enough to raise every hair on my arms and send ice water flowing through my veins. I was half asleep when it first happened, caught in that drowsy state between waking and dreaming where reality becomes negotiable. At first, I thought it was the wind slicing through the pine needles, but the night was dead still, not even a whisper of breeze disturbing the branches of the morning sentinels below. The whistle was too rhythmic, too purposeful. 3 short whistles, each one crystal clear despite the distance. Then silence that pressed against my eardrums like cotton. Then three more, identical in pitch and timing. I fumbled for my radio, fingers clumsy with sleep and growing dread. Base, this is Century Point. Do you copy? Nothing but static. I tried again, adjusting frequencies, checking connections. The radio was working, the green light steady, the battery full. But every channel gave me the same thing, white noise that seemed almost expectant. I grabbed the station's high-powered floodlight and swept it across the hollow of echoes below. The beam cut through the darkness like a sword, illuminating the twisted branches of the ancient pines. Nothing moved. No eyes reflected back at me. No shapes scurried for cover. And yet, the whistling kept coming. Not closer, not louder, but always exactly 3 whistles with mathematical precision. Like a call, or a code, or maybe a countdown. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing off the walls of Sorrow's throat, the narrow canyon that cut through the heart of the preserve. Sometimes it felt like it was coming from directly below the station. Other times, it seemed to drift down from the peaks of the Watching Hills, those bare summits that loomed over the preserve like the skulls of sleeping giants. At dawn, when the first pale light began to filter through the canopy of the Weeping Woods, I made my descent. I had to find the source, had to prove to myself that there was a rational explanation. Maybe a lost hiker. Maybe some kind of bird call I'd never encountered. Maybe just the wind playing tricks with the unique acoustics of the valley. I followed the echo trail down through Devil's Staircase, past the lichen-covered warning stones that marked the boundary of the deep green, the oldest section of the preserve, where the trees grew so thick that noon felt like twilight. I searched every clearing, every hollow, every place where a person might hide or camp. I found no footprints, no scat from any animal I could identify, not even broken branches or disturbed undergrowth. But I felt watched every step of the way. Not the kind of paranoia that comes from being alone too long in the wilderness. I knew that feeling well enough. This was different. This was that primal, evolutionary alarm that screams predator, that ancient part of the brain that remembers when humans were prey. It was the feeling of being studied by something patient and intelligent and utterly alien. And the worst part, when I climbed back up to Century Point Station, exhausted and rattled, my thermos, the one I distinctly remembered leaving on the kitchen counter inside, was sitting on the outer railing of the observation deck, still warm. The next day, as the morning mist rose from the hollow of echoes like the breath of sleeping spirits, a call came in over the emergency frequency. A solo hiker named Dale Meyerson hadn't checked in at the Twilight Ridge Ranger Station. He was supposed to finish a 3-day loop through the Forsaken Glen and never came back. I wasn't officially search and rescue, but something about the call made my blood run cold. Maybe it was the way the dispatcher's voice wavered when she mentioned his last known location, the Listening Stones, a circle of ancient granite monoliths deep in the heart of the preserve where sound behaved in ways that defied explanation. I volunteered to look. The hike to Dale's planned route took me through some of the most remote terrain in the preserve. I followed the Ghost Trail, a path so seldom used that it barely qualified as more than a deer run. It wound through the Whisper Groves, where the trees grew so close together that their branches intertwined overhead, creating a living tunnel that blocked out most of the sky. At first, nothing seemed off until I reached a clearing near the Weeping Falls, where Bone Creek tumbled over a series of limestone shelves worn smooth by centuries of flowing water. The locals call this place Tears of the Mountain, and standing there, I understood why. The sound of the water was mournful, almost like sobbing. I found Dale's campsite nestled between 2 massive boulders that the geological surveys had named the Guardian Stones. His tent was collapsed, the fabric shredded in long, deliberate tears. His gear was scattered in a perfect circle around the campsite, sleeping bag to the north, backpack to the south, cooking supplies to the east and west. It was too orderly to be the work of animals, too precise to be accidental. His food was untouched, still sealed in bear-proof containers. That alone sent chills down my spine. In my 12 years as a ranger, I never seen a campsite ransacked by animals where the food was left behind. But the worst part was the trail of pine needles. They formed a perfect circle around the entire campsite, each needle placed with mathematical precision. They were fresh, still green and fragrant, despite the fact that the nearest pine tree was over 100 yards away. And they weren't just scattered. They were arranged in patterns, spirals within spirals, like some kind of organic mandala. In the center of the needle circle, I found Dale's journal. The leather cover was damp with morning dew, but the pages inside were bone dry. I flipped to the last entry, dated 3 days ago. The handwriting started normal, but became increasingly erratic as it continued. Day 3. It's whistling again. Same 3 notes, always the same rhythm. But it's not from the trail anymore. It's not from any direction I can point to. It's like it's coming from inside the stones themselves, vibrating up through the ground and into my bones. I tried to leave this morning, but my compass is spinning. All directions look the same now. The trees, they're watching me. I can feel their attention like weight on my shoulders. God help me, I think I know what it wants. I think I know why it brought me here. If I don't make it back to the Twilight Ridge station, tell my wife Sarah I love her, and that I'm sorry for what I brought back from the Listening Stones. I should have left it buried. I should have left it alone. The whistling is getting closer. I can see shapes moving between the trees now, tall figures that look almost human but wrong, like scarecrows made of bark and shadow. They don't have faces, just hollow places where faces should be. I think they're calling to something else, something bigger, something that's been sleeping under the hollow of echoes for longer than this forest has existed. I can hear it stirring now. I can feel it waking up. What he brought back from the Listening Stones, what had been sleeping under the hollow of echoes. My hands were shaking as I radioed dispatch to report a missing person, possibly in distress. But when I pressed the transmit button, all I heard was that same 3-tone whistle, clear and mocking, coming from my own radio. And in the background, barely audible beneath the static, I could swear I heard something else, a sound like massive lungs drawing breath, like something vast and ancient slowly waking up. That night, sleep was impossible. Every creak in the station made my spine stiffen. Every whisper of wind through the eaves sounded like voices speaking in a language older than human memory. I sat at my desk with Dale's journal open before me, reading and rereading his final entries, trying to make sense of what he'd experienced. The Listening Stones were real enough. I'd visited them once during my orientation. They were a natural formation of granite monoliths arranged in a rough circle, each one about 12 feet tall and covered in strange erosion patterns that looked almost like writing. The acoustics there were unsettling. Sound seemed to linger longer than they should, and whispers carried much farther than the laws of physics suggested possible. But Dale wrote about finding something buried there, something he dug up and brought back with him. What could drive a man to desecrate what the local tribes considered sacred ground? Just after 2:13 a.m., I remember the exact time because the old station clock chimed the quarter hour the motion sensor outside triggered. The harsh electronic beep cut through the silence like a gunshot. My heart hammered against my ribs as I reached for the floodlight control. Whatever was out there, it was big enough to trip the sensor from 30 yards away. I clicked the switch. The beam lanced out across the observation deck, down the rocky slopes of Vigilance Peak, and into the edge of the morning sentinels below. For a moment, I saw nothing but the familiar landscape of twisted branches and shadow. Then my eyes adjusted, and I saw it. Something was standing at the very edge of the tree line, just where the ancient pines gave way to the rocky scree of the mountainside. It stood perfectly still, as if it had been there for hours, waiting patiently for me to notice. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a person. It was something profoundly, fundamentally wrong. The thing looked like a man, tall, broad-shouldered, with the general proportions of human anatomy. But its skin wasn't skin at all. It appeared to be made of pine bark, dark and deeply furrowed, with patches of moss and lichen growing across its surface like diseased flesh. Its limbs were too long, joints bending at angles that hurt to look at. But the face, God help me, the face was the worst part. Where features should have been, there were only cracks and crevices in the bark, deep fissures that formed rough approximations of eyes and a mouth. And from those hollow places, a faint red light glowed, pulsing slowly like a heartbeat. When the floodlight hit it full on, the thing tilted its head with a motion so human and yet so utterly wrong that every instinct I possessed screamed at me to run. It raised one impossibly long arm, a gesture almost like a greeting or perhaps a salute. And then it whistled. 3 short notes, the same sequence I've been hearing for days. But this time I could see where it came from. The sound emerged not from a mouth, but from dozens of small holes in the bark skin, like a living wooden flute. I bolted the door, grabbed my rifle, and sat with my back against the wall until morning, listening to that whistle echo through the hollow of echoes below. Sometimes it was answered by other whistles, coming from different points in the forest, a whole chorus of those things, communicating in their alien musical language. By sunrise, when I finally found the courage to look outside again, it was gone. No prints in the soft earth around the station. No broken branches where something that size should have passed. Nothing but the lingering smell of sap and rot and something else. Something that reminded me of very old wood in deep, dark places where sunlight never penetrated. But I knew it was still out there, somewhere in the desolation range, waiting and watching. The Park Service pulled me out of Sentry Point Station 2 days later. Just a rotation, District Supervisor Martinez told me over the radio, but I could hear the careful neutrality in his voice. We're sending Jenkins up to cover your shift. You're being reassigned to the Meadowbrook Visitor Center. Meadowbrook, a family-friendly section of the preserve where the biggest danger was tourists feeding the chipmunks. I knew better than to argue. Something had been reported, and not just by me. As I packed my few belongings, I did some research in the station's logbooks. The records went back 40 years, and the story they told was chilling. Rangers had been disappearing in the Whispering Shea Preserve for decades. Quietly, one at a time. Always off record, always explained away as transfers or resignations. But the names were there, buried in administrative paperwork. Rodriguez vanished in 1987 while investigating unusual animal activity near the Listening Stones. Chin, missing in 1994 after reporting structural anomalies in the trees around Tears of the Mountain. Williams, last seen in 2003, found weeks later at the bottom of Sorrow's throat with no memory of how he got there, and speaking only in whispers about the things that sing in the dark. The pattern was always the same. Rangers assigned to the deep backcountry, alone for extended periods, reporting strange sounds and sightings. Then disappearance, transfer, or psychological breakdown. I filed my final report, carefully omitted any mention of bark-faced entities or 3-note whistles, and transferred out of the Whispering Shea Preserve the next morning. As my truck wound down the Bone Trail for the last time, I caught sight of the morning sentinels in my rearview mirror, their ancient branches swaying in a wind I couldn't feel. 4 or 5 years I tried to forget. I took assignments in safer places, Yellowstone, the Grand Canyon, parks where the dangers were known quantities and the mysteries had been solved centuries ago. I told myself I'd imagine it all, stress-induced hallucinations brought on by too much isolation and too little human contact. But the story doesn't end there. Because last week, 5 years to the day after I left Sentry Point Station, I got a letter. No return address, postmarked from a town that doesn't exist according to the Postal Service database. Inside was a single photograph, printed on old-fashioned film paper that felt rough beneath my fingers. It was taken from inside the watchtower at Sentry Point, looking out toward the hollow of echoes. I recognized the view immediately, the same vista I'd stared at for weeks, memorizing every tree, every shadow. And standing just inside the tree lean, barely visible unless you knew exactly where to look, was a tall figure. Its bark-covered limbs were raised in that same gesture I remembered, half greeting and half salute. Its hollow eye sockets glowed with that familiar red light. On the back of the photograph, written in careful block letters with what looked like charcoal, was a single message. We remember. We are waiting. Come back to the listening stones. People think being a park ranger is all sunrises and wildlife, communing with nature in its purest form. They picture us as gentle guardians of America's natural beauty, protectors of majestic landscapes and noble wildlife. But the wild doesn't care about your romantic notions. Out there, in places like the Whispering Shade Preserve and the Hollow of Echoes, something older than human civilization lives beneath the canopy, something that remembers when our ancestors huddled around fires and told stories to keep the darkness at bay. And once you've seen it, once you've heard its ancient song echoing through places with names like Sorrow's Throat and the Valley of Forgotten Voices, it doesn't forget you. I wish I could say that my encounter with a thing in the Morning Sentinels was the only time I faced something that defied every law of nature I thought I understood. But it was just the beginning. In the next story, I'll tell you what happened when I found an abandoned ranger station in the Shadowfall Wilderness, a place that wasn't supposed to exist according to any map, but had been calling my name in dreams for months before I finally found the courage to answer. There are some places that don't show up on any map. Places where GPS fails, compasses spin wildly like dervishes possessed, and radio waves die in the air as if swallowed by invisible mouths. As a park ranger with 15 years under my belt, we call these dead zones, though that term barely scratches the surface of what they truly are. These aren't just areas of poor reception or magnetic interference. They're wounds in the landscape itself, places where reality seems to fray at the edges. Officially, they're written off as topographic anomalies caused by underground mineral deposits or unusual electromagnetic fields. The bureaucrats in their climate-controlled offices prefer neat explanations that fit on incident reports. But unofficially, those of us who patrol the deep wilderness know better. We know there's something else entirely. It was the bitter fall of 2013, when the aspens had already surrendered their gold to the merciless wind, that I was called in to investigate one such zone in a national park I won't name, not because of confidentiality agreements, but because I've learned that some places grow stronger when spoken of too often. A satellite map, grainy and distorted as if captured through murky water, showed an old ranger station deep in what we called the Whispering Hollow of Sector 6B, a designation that sent shivers down the spines of even the most seasoned rangers. The name came from hikers' reports of voices carried on the wind, conversations that seemed to drift from the trees themselves, always just beyond comprehension. Only there wasn't supposed to be a station in that cursed stretch of wilderness. Our records, meticulously maintained for over a century, showed nothing. No construction permits dating back to the park's founding. No structural surveys. No maintenance logs. Not even the faintest deer trail marked on our most detailed topographical maps. And yet the satellite image was undeniably clear, captured in that strange, otherworldly light that sometimes pierces the canopy in forgotten places. A small building with a moss-covered green roof, surrounded by the twisted embrace of ancient pines, half swallowed by decades of aggressive overgrowth that seemed to reach toward the structure with gnarled, finger-like branches. I was asked to investigate alone, a decision that should have raised every red flag in my experienced mind. Just a glitch in the system, they said with the casual dismissal of people who'd never spent a night alone in the deep woods. Probably some old hunter's shack or a forgotten fire lookout. Bring back photos and GPS coordinates. Document it for removal. That's all. I packed my standard gear, water for 3 days, emergency rations, camera, GPS unit, compass, first aid kit, and the service radio that would prove as useful as a paperweight where I was headed. I told my partner Jenkins I'd be back in 2 days, maybe 3 if the terrain proved difficult. But I wasn't back in 2 days. I wasn't back in 4. And when I finally stumbled out of the Whispering Hollow 7 days later, my uniform torn and my eyes holding shadows that hadn't been there before, I wasn't the same. This story isn't about ghosts or monsters, not exactly. Those are simple things, comprehensible in their malevolence. This is about a place that remembers everything that ever happened within its boundaries. A place that collects experiences like a hoarder collects treasures, storing them in the rings of trees and the whispers of wind through hollow logs. A place that wants to be found by the curious and the lost, but refuses to let them leave unchanged. I shouldn't be telling this story. Every instinct developed through years of wilderness survival screams at me to let it die in silence. But if someone else stumbles across that damned satellite image, if another ranger gets the same assignment I did, maybe these words will be the only thing standing between them and a fate worse than simply vanishing into the woods forever. It started with a printout that appeared on my desk like a death sentence written in pixels and paper. Sarah Martinez, our park cartographer, a meticulous woman who treated every map revision like a sacred ritual, had flagged a strange anomaly during her quarterly review of satellite imaging data. Her weathered hand shook slightly as she handed me the photograph. Her usual professional composure cracked like old leather. "I've been doing this for 23 years, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know every square inch of this park, every trail, every structure, every goddamn rock formation. This shouldn't be here." The aerial photo showed a small clearing in the heart of the Whispering Hollow, a perfect circle of bare earth surrounded by forest, so dense it appeared black from above. In the center sat a structure that made my skin crawl just looking at it. Too angular for nature, too weathered for recent construction, too deliberate for abandonment. I assumed it was a poacher's hide or an illegal hunter's cabin. We found them before, ramshackle structures thrown together by people who thought federal land was their personal hunting preserve. But something about this one felt different. The shadows fell wrong around it, creating patterns that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. But the truly disturbing detail was barely visible in the satellite image's grainy resolution. The structure bore ranger markings. You could make out the faded outline of a green cross on what appeared to be the roof, and if you squinted and tilted your head just right, traces of USDA lettering were visible on what might have been a sign. I took the photo to my supervisor, Chief Ranger Patricia Holbrook, a woman carved from granite and 30 years of wilderness management. She'd seen everything these woods could throw at a person: lost hikers, bear maulings, flash floods, and the occasional drug operation. Nothing rattled her. Until I showed her that photograph. Her face went pale as winter frost, and she was quiet for so long I wondered if she'd forgotten I was there. Finally, she looked up with eyes that seemed to have aged years in the span of minutes. "No one's been assigned to patrol the Whispering Hollow in over 30 years, she said, her voice carrying the weight of old decisions and older regrets. "That area's been sealed off due to unstable terrain and other factors. There's no ranger station there. There's never been a ranger station there. Then why was there one now?" She gave me clearance to investigate, but her hands trembled as she signed the authorization form. "Just you," she emphasized, pressing the pen so hard it nearly tore through the paper. "Keep the report internal. And for God's sake, don't stay overnight." Why the secrecy? I should have asked. Should have pressed for more information about those other factors she'd mentioned. But after 15 years as a ranger, you learn that some questions open doors better left closed, and some answers carry weights too heavy for one person to bear. As I left her office, I heard her whisper something under her breath. It sounded like a prayer, though Patricia Holbrook wasn't a praying woman. Later, I would understand why. The hike began at dawn from the old logging road that marked the boundary of the known world. Beyond this point, the maps became suggestions rather than facts, and the GPS coordinates grew increasingly unreliable, as if the satellites themselves refused to acknowledge what lay ahead. I followed what remained of an ancient deer trail, little more than broken twigs and disturbed leaves, into the heart of the Whispering Hollow. The first 3 hours were deceptively normal. Standard Pacific Northwest forest, Douglas fir and western hemlock creating a cathedral ceiling high above, ferns carpeting the forest floor in prehistoric luxury, and the occasional glimpse of a curious squirrel or wary deer. My radio crackled with periodic check-ins from base camp, Jenkins's voice a comforting anchor to the civilized world I was leaving behind. But by mile 4, things began to change. The underbrush grew denser, more aggressive, as if the forest itself was trying to bar my passage. Branches seemed to reach for my pack with deliberate malice, and roots rose from the earth like gnarled fingers eager to trip the unwary. My GPS signal flickered and died, the screen displaying only static where satellite data should have been. The compass spun lazily in its housing, unable to decide which direction was north. Worse was the silence. It crept in gradually, so subtly that I didn't notice it at first. The cheerful chatter of songbirds faded to an occasional chirp, then to nothing. Even the ever-present buzz of insects died away, leaving only the sound of my boots on increasingly spongy earth and my own labored breathing. The trees themselves seemed wrong. They grew taller here, stretching toward a canopy so thick it filtered daylight into a perpetual twilight. Their trunks were twisted into impossible spirals, as if they'd spent decades writhing in slow-motion agony. Moss draped them like funeral shrouds, hanging in thick curtains that swayed without any wind to move them. And they seemed to be leaning inward, toward the path I walked, as if listening to my footsteps and finding them wanting. By the 7th hour, when my legs ached and my water supply had dwindled to half capacity, I found a clearing Sarah's satellite had captured. It was wrong in ways that defied easy description. The circle of bare earth was too perfect, its boundaries too precise to be natural. The soil looked scorched, though there was no evidence of recent fire. No grass grew within its perimeter, no weeds pushed through the cracked earth, no insects crawled across its surface. It was a dead zone in the most literal sense, a place where life itself seemed to have given up. The station sat in the exact center like a tumor in healthy tissue. Weather-beaten with it might once have been painted brown now, showed the gray of decades-old neglect. The roof had partially caved on the eastern side, creating shadows within shadows that seemed to move independently of the wan light filtering through the canopy. Both the front and back doors hung open, revealing a darkness so complete it might have been solid. Above the main entrance, barely visible beneath layers of moss and decay, a rusted sign clung to the frame with the determination of the damned. Station 119, Whispering Hollow Outpost EST 1962. There was no Station 119 in any record I'd ever seen, and I'd memorized the designation numbers of every ranger facility in 3 states. Station numbers were assigned chronologically and never reused. The highest number in our system was 87. So where had 119 come from? The air around the station felt thick, almost viscous, like breathing through wet cotton. Each step toward the structure required conscious effort, as if some invisible force was pushing back against my approach. My skin crawled with the sensation of being watched by eyes I couldn't see, and the back of my neck prickled with a primitive warning system that had kept my ancestors alive in places like this. I should have turned around. Should have marked the location and hiked back to report the anomaly to better-equipped investigators. Every instinct I developed in 15 years of wilderness work screamed at me to flee. Instead, I approached the open door and stepped across the threshold into Station 119. The darkness inside swallowed my flashlight beam like hungry quicksand. The interior of Station 119 was a museum of abandonment, frozen in time like an insect trapped in amber. Everything was exactly where it had been left, as if the occupants had simply vanished mid-task. Coffee mugs sat on the rough wooden table, their contents long since evaporated into brown-stained rings. Ranger jackets hung on wall hooks, as if their owners had just stepped outside for a moment and would return any second. Weather charts from 1976 were still pinned to a cork board, their predictions for storms that had passed decades ago now yellow with age. But the most unsettling detail was how preserved it all looked. In the Pacific Northwest's relentless humidity, abandoned structures typically succumbed to rot and decay within a few years. Mold should have claimed the walls. Rust should have consumed the metal fixtures, and insects should have built their empires in the forgotten corners. Instead, Station 119 existed in a state of perfect suspension, as if time moved differently within its walls. I played my flashlight beam across scattered logbooks, their leather bindings still supple despite their age. A manual typewriter sat on a desk in the corner, a sheet of paper still wound around its roller, half-finished words trailing off mid-sentence. Personal effects were scattered throughout. Photographs of families that existed only in fading black and white, letters that would never be delivered, and small treasures that had once meant everything to someone. That's when I noticed the radio. It sat on a shelf above the desk, an old Motorola unit from the early 70s. The power cord was still plugged into a wall outlet that hadn't seen electricity in decades, yet somehow the device hummed with a low, almost subliminal vibration. Its LED display flickered weakly, cycling through frequencies that shouldn't have existed. But the building hadn't had power in 40 years. I approached the radio with the caution of a bomb disposal expert. The humming grew louder as I drew closer, and occasionally I could make out fragments of sound, not quite voices, but something that might have been voices if heard from very far away or through very deep water. The logbooks drew my attention next. I found the main duty log near the typewriter, its leather binding worn smooth by years of handling. The entries were written in multiple hands, different rangers recording their observations and experiences in methodical style required by Park Service protocols. The final entries, all dated from March 1976, told a story that made my hands shake as I read. March 8, 1976. Ranger Thompson reporting. Strange activity continues in the forest surrounding our position. Wildlife has completely abandoned the area. Satellite communication intermittent. Requesting backup and investigation team. March 12, 1976. Subject appeared again at tree line approximately 0300 hours. Tall humanoid figure, wearing what appeared to be standard ranger uniform. Observed through binoculars for 37 minutes. Figure remained motionless, watching station. We advised HQ via radio. No response received. March 15, 1976, Peterson reported hearing whistling from the forest during night watch. Melody unfamiliar, but somehow compelling. I heard it too. Seemed to be coming from multiple directions simultaneously. Neither of us could resist investigating. Found nothing in the woods except our own footprints leading in circles. March 21, 1976. Radio contact with headquarters completely failed. Equipment functional, battery charged, signal strong. All attempts to establish communication met with silence. Attempts to hike out have proven unsuccessful. The forest appears to be rearranging itself. Compass readings inconsistent. GPS equipment malfunctioned. March 25, 1976. Peterson walked into woods during the night. Security footage shows him responding to whistling sounds. Footage cuts out at 0347 hours. He has not returned. I am now alone. March 28, 1976. It knows I'm alone now. It's been circling the station. I can see it through the windows, always just at the edge of the light, always watching. It wears Peterson's face now. March 30th, 1976, final entry. I have locked all doors and windows, though I suspect it won't matter. It's in here with me now. I can hear it moving in the walls, speaking with Peterson's voice, then Thompson's voice, then my own. If anyone finds this record, do not attempt rescue. Do not investigate further. Some places should remain forgotten. The handwriting in that final entry was barely legible, scrawled with the desperation of a man fighting madness. That's when I noticed something carved into the wooden surface beneath the desk, gouged deep into the grain with what looked like fingernails. The trees remember everything the hollow keeps what it takes we are still here. I flipped to the last page of the logbook, expecting to find blank paper. Instead, I found a fresh entry, written in blue ink that was still wet. Welcome back. We've been waiting. The handwriting was mine. I should have run. Every rational part of my mind screamed at me to drop the logbook, sprint through that door, and not stop running until I reached the safety of civilization. But something kept me rooted to the spot, something stronger than fear or curiosity. It was recognition. Station 119 felt familiar in a way that made no sense, as if I'd been here before in dreams I couldn't quite remember. The layout of the rooms, the placement of the furniture, even the quality of light filtering through the dust-caked windows, all of it triggered a sense of homecoming that was more terrifying than any ghost story. I made camp inside the station as darkness fell across the Whispering Hollow like a predator claiming its territory. The logical choice would have been to set up my tent outside, in the clearing where I could see approaching threats and maintain some psychological distance from whatever had happened within these walls. But the thought of spending the night in that dead circle of earth, exposed to the watching eyes I could feel tracking my every movement, was unbearable. Inside the station, I could at least maintain the illusion of shelter. I spread my sleeping bag on the floor near the back wall, as far from the open doors as possible. My camping stove provided both warmth and the comfort of normal, explainable light, a small bubble of rationality, in a place where reason seemed to be just another abandoned artifact. As I prepared a simple meal of instant coffee and energy bars, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being observed. Not from outside the station, but from within. As if the walls themselves had developed eyes, or the shadows in the corners had gained awareness and found my presence deeply interesting. The radio continued its soft humming, occasionally bursting into brief fragments of static that almost sounded like conversation. I found myself straining to make out words, to catch some meaning in the electronic chaos, but the sounds remained tantalizingly just beyond comprehension. That night, sleep came despite my intentions to remain alert. I dreamed of trees bending down like arthritic giants, their branches forming impossible angles as they leaned toward earth that pulsed with its own dark heartbeat. The forest whispered secrets in a language older than human speech, sharing knowledge that no living mind was meant to contain. In my dream, the trees were trying to tell me something important. Something about the station, about the rangers who had come before, about the choice I would soon have to make. But every time I thought I understood, the meaning slipped away like water through desperate fingers. I woke to absolute darkness. My watch, somehow still functioning despite the electromagnetic anomalies, read 2:47 a.m. The temperature had dropped significantly. My breath formed visible clouds in the flashlight beam, and frost was already crystallizing on the inside of the windows. Outside, the Whispering Hollow had awakened. There was a sound, not the normal orchestra of nocturnal forest life, but something far more deliberate. Scraping wood, like massive fingernails dragging down tree bark in rhythmic patterns. The sound circled the station, moving from wall to wall with the patience of a predator testing for weaknesses. I lay perfectly still in my sleeping bag, controlling my breathing, listening with the enhanced awareness that fear provides. The scraping continued for nearly an hour, sometimes pausing directly outside windows as if whatever made the sound was peering inside, studying the contents of the station with the thoroughness of an appraiser cataloging valuable possessions. Then, at exactly 3:33 a.m., the radio crackled to life. Static filled the room, followed by a voice, faint, distorted, but unmistakably familiar. It spoke the single sentence that turned my blood to ice water. "It's in here with me." The voice was mine, but I hadn't spoken. Dawn brought no relief, only the gray half-light that passes for morning in the depths of the Whispering Hollow. I packed my gear with shaking hands, my mind reeling from the previous night's events. The logical explanation was that I had been dreaming, that stress and isolation had caused me to hallucinate voices on the radio. Rangers were trained to recognize the psychological effects of prolonged solitude, and I'd seen strong men break under far less pressure than what I was experiencing. But the radio was still humming, and there were no batteries in it. I decided to leave, return to headquarters with photographs and GPS coordinates, file my report, and let someone else figure out what Station 119 was and why it existed in a location that didn't appear on any map. I had done my duty by investigating. I wasn't required to solve every mystery the wilderness presented. Except the wilderness had other plans. I marked my path carefully, using orange surveyor's tape to blaze trees at regular intervals. I took compass readings every 100 yards, photographed distinctive landmarks, and made detailed notes in my field journal. These were the basic techniques every ranger learned in training, the fundamental skills that prevented people from becoming statistics in search and rescue reports. But no matter which direction I walked, no matter how carefully I navigated, I always returned to the clearing. It was impossible. I had 40 years of combined education and experience in wilderness navigation. I understood magnetic declination, topographical interpretation, and celestial navigation. I could find my way out of any forest in North America using nothing but a stick and the position of the sun. Yet after 3 hours of hiking, I emerged from the tree line to find Station 119 waiting for me like a patient undertaker. The orange tape I had used to mark my route was nowhere to be seen. The landmarks I had photographed seemed to have rearranged themselves into new configurations. Even the weather had changed. What had begun as a clear morning was now overcast, with clouds that moved in patterns that defied meteorology. I tried burning a distinctive mark into a large pine tree, carving my initials deep into the bark and setting a small fire at its base to create an unmistakable landmark. Then I hiked due east for exactly 1 hour, maintaining a steady pace and checking my watch every 10 minutes. When I emerged from the forest, the burned tree was directly behind the station. But according to my compass, I had never changed direction. That evening, as I sat in the station trying to process what was happening, I saw the figure for the first time. It stood at the tree line, just visible in the fading light. Tall, human-shaped, wearing what appeared to be a standard Park Service uniform, complete with a distinctive ranger hat. The figure didn't move, didn't shift its weight, didn't even seem to breathe. It simply watched the station with the patience of something that had been waiting far longer than any human lifetime. I studied it through binoculars, trying to make out details in the gathering dusk. The uniform was authentic down to the smallest details, proper patches, correct insignia, even what appeared to be a regulation utility belt. But there was something wrong with the way it stood, something too rigid and unnatural, as if it was a person-shaped thing that had learned to imitate human posture without truly understanding it. Then the figure turned its head toward me, and I saw its face clearly for the first time. It was my own face, perfect in every detail except for the eyes. The eyes were black pits that reflected light like still water, and they held an intelligence that was ancient and patient and utterly inhuman. The thing wearing my face raised one hand in a greeting, or perhaps a mockery of a greeting, and smiled with lips that moved too slowly, as if they were remembering how expressions were supposed to work. I stumbled backward from the window, my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged bird desperate for escape. When I looked again, the figure was gone, but carved into the window frame, in letters that definitely hadn't been there before, was a message. Soon, over the next 48 hours, Station 119 became my prison. The building itself began to change in subtle but deeply unsettling ways. Furniture rearranged itself when I wasn't looking directly at it. The logbooks rewrote themselves, new entries appearing in handwriting that cycled through every ranger who had ever been assigned to the Whispering Hollow, including my own. Photographs on the walls showed faces that shifted and blurred, sometimes showing people I'd never seen, sometimes showing versions of myself from angles that should have been impossible. But the most disturbing change was the mirrors. They appeared gradually, one by one, hanging on walls where they hadn't been before. Old mirrors with silver backing that had darkened with age, creating reflections that were just slightly off, showing the room from perspectives that didn't quite match reality, displaying shadows that fell in the wrong directions, revealing things that weren't actually there. On the morning of the third day, I found a tape recorder sitting on the desk. It was an ancient reel-to-reel model, the kind used for dictation in the 1970s. The tape was already loaded and appeared to have been recently used. I could see where it had been rewound to the beginning. A piece of paper was taped to the machine, with a single word written in my own handwriting. Play. My hand shook as I pressed the playback button. The tape hissed with static for several seconds before a voice emerged. My voice, but desperate and raw with terror. Day 7. If anyone finds this recording, if anyone is still looking for me, I need you to understand what this place is. Station 119 isn't just abandoned, it's active. It's been collecting rangers for decades, maybe longer. It studies us, learns from us, copies us. The thing in the woods, the thing that looks like me, it's not the first. There are others. I've seen them in the mirrors, in the reflections in the windows. Dozens of them, all wearing the faces of rangers who came here and never left. They're getting better at it, better at being human. But they're not human. There's something else wearing our skins. It knows what we fear because it can reach into our minds and pull out our deepest terrors. It shows us our own deaths, our own failures, our own dark thoughts reflected back at us until we can't tell what's real anymore. Don't trust what you see. Don't trust what you hear. And whatever you do, don't look in the mirrors. They show you things that haven't happened yet, or things that have already happened to other versions of yourself. I've tried to leave 17 times. The forest brings me back. The paths change. Time moves differently here. I think I might not be the first version of myself to make this recording. I found other tapes, dozens of them, all with my voice saying the same things. But I don't remember making them. If you're hearing this, you need to get out. No, don't stay another night. Don't try to understand what's happening. Just run and keep running until you're back in the real world where mirrors only show what's actually there. My name is, I can't remember my name anymore. But I'm a ranger, and this is my final report. The tape ended with the sound of something large crashing through the station's front door, followed by a scream that went on far too long before cutting to silence. I stared at the machine in horror. I hadn't made that recording. I was certain I hadn't made that recording. But it was undeniably my voice, sharing knowledge I somehow possessed despite never having experienced the events described. That's when I noticed the other mirrors. They had multiplied while I was listening to the tape, covering every available wall surface. Dozens of them, all reflecting the same scene from slightly different angles, creating a kaleidoscope effect that made the room seem to extend infinitely in all directions. In each mirror, my reflection stood in a slightly different position. Some showed me holding the tape recorder. Others showed me backing toward the door. A few showed me screaming silently, my mouth open in terror at something I couldn't see. But in the largest mirror, directly opposite where I stood, my reflection was smiling. And I definitely wasn't smiling. The reflection mouthed a single word, soon. I smashed the largest mirror with my hiking boot, watching it explode into 1,000 fragments that reflected 1,000 different versions of the station, each one showing subtle variations in furniture arrangement, lighting, and occupancy. In some of the fragments, I could see other figures moving through the station, rangers in different uniforms from different eras, all going about their daily routines as if nothing was wrong. They filed reports, maintained equipment, and stared out windows at a forest that looked nothing like the whispering hollow I knew. The sound of breaking glass echoed strangely, multiplying and reverberating until it seemed like every mirror in existence was shattering simultaneously. The remaining mirrors on the walls cracked and spider-webbed, but they didn't fall. Instead, they continued to show their distorted reflections, now fragmented into a jigsaw puzzle of impossible perspectives. I ran through the door, across the dead circle of the clearing, and into the forest that had become my labyrinth. Branches tore at my clothes and pack, roots tried to trip me, and the very air seemed to thicken in opposition to my escape. I screamed until my throat bled, bellowing challenges at the things that watched from the shadows, daring them to show themselves and face me directly. For 3 hours I ran through the twisted maze of the Whispering Hollow, following paths that appeared and disappeared like thoughts in a fevered mind. The forest around me shifted constantly, familiar landmarks vanishing, new obstacles appearing, the very topology of the land flowing like water. Then, impossibly, I found salvation. A trail marker, bright yellow plastic with fresh paint and official Park Service markings. Human footprints in the soft earth, still fresh, still real. The artificial scent of civilization carried on the wind, diesel exhaust, coffee, the chemical tang of modern life. I followed the trail marker like a moth following flame, stumbling and weaving through forest that gradually became normal again. The oppressive silence lifted. Birds began to sing. Insects resumed their eternal humming. The very light seemed to brighten as I left the influence of the Whispering Hollow behind. The trail led me to another ranger station, but this one was real, clean, active. Solar panels gleamed on the roof, and I could hear the hum of modern electrical systems. A Park Service vehicle was parked outside, and smoke rose from the chimney in the gray dawnlight. I collapsed at the front door, my strength finally giving out. The last thing I remembered was the concerned face of a young ranger as he helped me inside, his radio crackling with calls for medical assistance. When I woke up in the regional medical center 2 days later, they told me a story that made no sense. According to their records, I had never left the main campground area. My GPS tracker, the one every ranger was required to carry, showed that I had remained within a 400-foot radius of the visitor center for the entire time I was missing. The search teams had combed that area repeatedly and found no sign of me, but the electronic evidence was irrefutable. I tried to tell them about Station 119, about the Whispering Hollow, about the mirrors and the figure wearing my face. Chief Ranger Holbrook sat by my hospital bed, her expression unreadable. When I finished my account, she was quiet for a long time. Finally, she spoke the words that I'll never forget, words that stripped away my reality and left me floating in uncertainty. There is no Station 119. There never was. We've checked every record, every archive, every historical document. No ranger facility has ever been constructed in Sector 6B. The area you describe is geologically unstable and has been off-limits to personnel since the park's founding. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. But you're the third ranger to come back from that area with the same story. The others, they never quite recovered. They retired early, moved away, tried to forget. But they still call sometimes late at night, asking if we found the station yet. I returned to active duty after a month of psychological evaluation and mandatory counseling. Officially, I had suffered a severe anxiety episode brought on by isolation stress and dehydration. The incident was filed under medical leave rather than unexplained disappearance, and I was assigned to patrol areas much closer to headquarters. But I couldn't let it go. 3 years later, I organized a private expedition back to Sector 6B. I brought my own GPS equipment, my own cameras, and a team of experienced hikers who specialized in wilderness exploration. We used the same satellite coordinates, followed the same route, and searched every square inch of the area where Station 119 should have been. There was nothing there. No clearing. No structure. No sign that human beings had ever set foot in that part of the forest. The Whispering Hollow itself seemed to have vanished, replaced by ordinary woodland that showed no trace of the wrongness I remembered. Even the trees were different, younger, healthier, arranged in natural patterns that followed normal forest growth. But sometimes, when I'm alone on patrol and the radio is turned low, I hear fragments of familiar voices drifting through the static. My own voice, sometimes. Other times it's voices I don't recognize, rangers calling for help from places that don't exist. And sometimes, in the early hours of the morning, when the forest is still and the shadows are long, I catch glimpses of figures moving through the trees. They wear familiar uniforms and carry standard equipment, but they walk with the wrong rhythm and turn their heads at angles that are just slightly off. They're getting better at being human. But they're not human. The official records show no Station 119. The satellite images from 2013 have been mysteriously corrupted, showing only static where the structure should have been. Chief Ranger Holbrook retired 6 months after my return, moving to Arizona and refusing to discuss her career in the Pacific Northwest. Sarah Martinez, our cartographer, disappeared entirely. Her desk was cleaned out one morning, her keys turned in, her final paycheck unclaimed. Security footage shows her leaving the building at 5:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, but she never made it to her car in the parking lot. I think she went looking for Station 119, and I think she found it. Everyone knows caves are dangerous, not because of what's inside them, but because of what they awaken inside you. The stillness that presses against your eardrums like water. The echo that takes your voice and twists it into something unrecognizable before hurling it back. The crushing realization that you're completely, utterly alone in the dark hundreds of feet below the surface, where no cell tower reaches, no scream carries, no prayer finds its way to whatever God might be listening above. The weight of stone overhead becomes the weight of your own mortality, pressing down until each breath feels borrowed, stolen from the earth itself. I've done countless cave inspections in my career as a park ranger for the Northern Wilderness Preserve. I've rappelled into the midnight depths of the Abyss Lakes, where underground rivers run black as oil. I've army crawled through the serpent's throat, sandstone passages so narrow they grip your ribs like skeletal fingers. I've helped recover bodies from the collapsed widows' mine shafts, where men went to dig for copper and found only their graves. But nothing, and I mean nothing, compares to the nightmare I found beneath Sorrow's Crown Ridge. That place isn't just a cave. It's a trap. A breathing, thinking, hungry trap that feeds on more than flesh and bone. It feeds on memory itself. And once it knows your name, once it tastes the flavor of your thoughts, it won't let go. It'll follow you home. It'll whisper through your walls. It'll wear your face when you look in mirrors. I shouldn't be alive. And honestly, in the 3 months since I crawled out of that hellish maze, I don't know if I truly am. Because ever since I came back, I hear it everywhere. In my dreams, where I'm always falling through endless stone corridors. In my thoughts, where my own internal voice sometimes uses words I never spoke. In my reflection, where sometimes, just for a split second, I see eyes that aren't quite mine. And sometimes, late at night when the house settles and the floorboards creak, I hear it whisper from the crawl space beneath my feet. You left me behind. You left us all behind. But we remember you. This is my story. And maybe if you listen carefully, if you pay attention to every word and watch for the signs I'm about to show you, you'll understand why some caves should stay sealed forever. Why some places in this world are meant to remain untouched by human feet or human light. Because there are doorways that should never be opened. And some of them look exactly like caves. It started like most shifts in October, with death knocking at my office door. A missing person call came through the dispatch radio at 6:47 a.m., crackling with static and urgency. A group of 5 spelunkers had gone off-trail near Sorrow's Crown Ridge, venturing into the restricted eastern sector of the preserve where warning signs bloom like poisonous flowers on every tree. One of them had resurfaced alone at dawn, stumbling out of the forest like a man fleeing a war zone. Catatonic, incoherent, clothes shredded, skin pale as cave limestone. When the sheriff's department found him wandering along Deadfall Highway, he was muttering the same phrase over and over. The echoes speak back. They know our names. They know everything. His friends, still underground, still missing, still screaming, according to his fractured testimony. Search and rescue was already mobilizing, but they called me in because I'd surveyed that area before. I knew the terrain. I knew the hidden sinkholes, the unstable cliff faces, the places where inexperienced cavers went to die. Here's the thing that made my blood run cold. I've been mapping caves in that region for 15 years, and I'd never heard of any cave system where the survivor claimed his group had entered. It wasn't on any of our geological surveys. Not in the Park Service database. Not even in the old mining records from the 1800s, when desperate men dug holes wherever they thought they might strike silver or gold. But the survivor, a guy named Marcus Holloway, according to his driver's license, swore the entrance was clearly marked. Said it looked ancient, far older than the natural limestone formations in the area. The opening was framed with carved stones, he claimed, covered in symbols that looked almost like writing, but in no alphabet he recognized. Runes, he kept calling them, though his eyes were too wild, too unfocused to trust completely. Still, for people were missing. That meant I was going in, regardless of whether I believed his story about mysterious cave entrails and ancient carvings. I packed my gear with extra care that morning. Triple-checked my ropes, my lights, my emergency beacon. Something about Marcus's testimony had left a cold stone in my stomach that wouldn't dissolve, no matter how much coffee I poured on top of it. The rescue team met me at the Bone Creek trailhead just after sunrise. 6 of us total. Myself, 2 search and rescue coordinators, a paramedic, and 2 local volunteers who knew the ridge system better than most. We hiked in single file along the Sorrowmaker Trail, a winding path that climbs through dense stands of Douglas fir and lodgepole pine. The morning mist hung low between the trees like spider webs, and every footfall seemed muffled, absorbed by the forest as if sound itself was reluctant to travel here. It took us 47 minutes to reach the coordinates Marcus had provided. At first, we found nothing. Just a steep rock face covered in lichen and bird droppings, with no visible cave entrance anywhere. We spread out, searching for any crack or fissure large enough for a human being to squeeze through. That's when Rodriguez, one of the SAR coordinators, called out from behind a cluster of fallen boulders. "Found something," he said, but his voice carried a strange undertone, like he'd discovered something he wished he hadn't. We gathered around the rockfall, massive stones that looked like they'd tumbled from the cliff face sometime in the recent past. The boulders were granite, but they were covered in a fine gray dust that got on everything we touched. Behind the boulder field, hidden in shadow, was an opening. Not a natural cave mouth. Not a mining tunnel either. This was something else entirely. The entrance was perfectly round, about 7 feet in diameter, carved into the living rock with precision that would challenge modern tools. The edges were smooth as glass, and just as Marcus had claimed, there were symbols etched into the stone frame. Not runes. Not any human language I'd ever seen. They looked almost organic, like something had grown rather than been carved into the rock. And they were warm to the touch. The entrance to the cave system required a 30-foot rappel down a vertical shaft lined with that same impossibly smooth stone. As soon as we clipped into our ropes and began the descent, the temperature plummeted. Not the gradual cooling you expect when entering any cave system, but a sudden dramatic drop that turned our breath to vapor and made our gear creak with thermal stress. This wasn't the usual underground chill that comes from being insulated from surface weather. This was something else. Something that felt deliberate. Hostile. The air itself felt dead. Stagnant. Like breathing inside a sealed tomb that hadn't been opened for centuries. My headlamp beams struggled to penetrate the darkness below us. Usually, LED lights cut through cave darkness like a blade. But here, the shadows seemed to absorb the illumination, drinking it up and giving nothing back. Rodriguez went first, his boots scraping against stone as he descended. Then Martinez, the paramedic. Then the 2 volunteers. I went last, double-checking everyone's anchor points and fighting the growing certainty that we were making a terrible mistake. The shaft opened into a main passage about 12 feet wide and 8 feet high. The walls were that same melted glass smoothness we'd seen at the entrance, not natural erosion, not hand-carved either. The stone looked almost organic, like the inside of some massive throat. Our voices echoed strangely here. Words seemed to stretch and distort before coming back to us changed. When Martinez called out to test the acoustics, what came back sounded like a different voice entirely. We found the first body 19 minutes after entering the main passage. Jake Morrison, according to the wallet in his back pocket. Age 24. One of the missing spelunkers from Marcus's group. He was sitting upright against the wall, knees drawn to his chest, arms wrapped around his shins. His helmet was cracked down the middle like an eggshell. His face was chalk white, eyes wide open and staring at something none of us could see. But it was his hands that made my stomach turn. His fingernails were torn off, all 10 of them. His fingertips were bloody hamburger, worn down to the bone from clawing at the stone wall behind him. But when we examined the surface where he'd been sitting, there wasn't a single scratch mark. The rock was as smooth and unmarked as polished marble. He'd torn his fingers to shreds trying to claw through stone that couldn't be damaged. Rodriguez knelt beside the body, checking for a pulse, even though it was obviously too late. What the hell was he trying to dig through? He muttered. That's when we heard it. A whisper. Soft, barely audible above the sound of our own breathing. Like someone calling our names from deeper in the cave system. At first, I thought it was auditory hallucination, a common phenomenon in cave environments. The way sound bounces and distorts in underground spaces can play tricks on your mind. You start hearing your own heartbeat, your own thoughts, turned into phantom voices by the acoustics. But this was different. This was deliberate. Rodriguez, the whisper said, clear as crystal. Rodriguez, come deeper. Come see what we found. Rodriguez went pale. He stood up slowly, backing away from the dead spelunker. That's not possible, he said. Nobody knows I'm here except us, the whisper replied, and now it was coming from multiple directions at once. A chorus of soft voices, all speaking in perfect unison. We've been waiting for you, Rodriguez. We've been waiting for all of you. Martinez grabbed his radio, tried to call back to base camp. Nothing but static. The stone walls were blocking our signal, just as I'd expected. But somehow that static sounded almost like voices, like dozens of people trying to speak through the interference. One of the volunteers, a local caver named Thompson, suddenly dropped his gear and started walking toward the deeper passages. Thompson, I called out. Stay with the group. He didn't respond. Didn't even slow down. Just kept walking into the darkness like he was sleepwalking. Rodriguez and I ran after him, our headlamps cutting wild arcs through the shadows. The passage was sloping downward now, and the walls were changing. No longer that smooth, glass-like stone. Now they were dark, reflective, like obsidian or volcanic glass. But when our lights hit those walls, the reflections were wrong. Instead of showing us 5 people in caving gear carrying emergency equipment, the walls reflected dozens of figures. Shadowy forms that moved independently of our movements. That turned to watch us pass. That smiled with teeth like broken glass. We caught up with Thompson at a junction where the main passage split into 3 smaller tunnels. He was standing motionless, staring at something carved into the wall where the passages diverged. Writing. Not carved into the stone. Not painted or etched. Burned. Like someone had used a branding iron to sear letters directly into the volcanic glass. And it spelled out names. Our names. All of our names. Not just the rescue team, but the missing spelunkers too. Jake Morrison, whose body we'd found. His 4 friends who were still somewhere in this maze. Even Marcus Holloway, the survivor who'd led us here. But there were others. Names I recognized from missing person reports going back years. Rangers who'd vanished during routine patrols. Hikers who'd wandered off trail and never been found. Some of the names were burned so deeply into the stone that they looked ancient, weathered, like they'd been there for decades. How is this possible? Martinez whispered, running his fingers over the carved letters. The walls whispered back. We remember everyone who comes here. We remember their names, their voices, their fears, and we never let them leave. We should have turned back then. Should have retreated to the surface, sealed the entrance, and called for military support or hazmat teams or whatever government agency handles things that shouldn't exist. But Thompson was already walking into the left-hand passage, drawn by something he couldn't explain. And Rodriguez was following, muttering about hearing his dead brother's voice calling from the darkness. The thing about caves is that they mess with your head in predictable ways. Sensory deprivation, auditory hallucinations, spatial disorientation. I'd studied the psychology of underground environments. I knew the warning signs. This wasn't that. This was something actively malevolent. Something that knew exactly how to burrow into your mind and find the soft spots. The places where grief lived, where guilt made it home, where the deepest fears were buried like landmines, waiting for the wrong step to set them off. The left passage sloped steeply downward, and the walls continued to change. Now they looked almost organic, not like stone at all, but like the inside of some vast organism. The surface was ridged and textured, like the walls of an artery or the lining of a stomach. And it was warm. Not just warm to the touch, actually radiating heat like living tissue. When I pressed my palm against the wall, I could swear I felt a pulse. A slow rhythmic throbbing that matched the cadence of a resting heart. Our headlamps were growing dimmer. The LED bulbs should have had at least 6 hours of battery life left, but the light was fading as if something was actively draining the power. "Check your equipment," I called out to the team. Light sources, radios, GPS units. Everything. What we found made no sense. Our gear was functioning normally according to all internal diagnostics. Full batteries. Strong signals from satellite connections. But nothing worked correctly. The GPS showed our location as the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The radios received only static that sounded increasingly like whispered conversations in languages that predated human speech. And our lights were being absorbed by the walls themselves. The beams seemed to sink into the stone like water into sand, leaving only feeble glows that barely illuminated our feet. That's when Rodriguez stopped walking and pointed his dying flashlight at something ahead of us. Another body. This one was different. Fresher. It was Sarah Chin, one of the missing spelunkers from Marcus's group. But she wasn't sitting upright like Jake Morrison had been. She was standing, leaning against the wall in a casual pose, arms crossed, head tilted slightly to one side, like she was waiting for someone. As we approached, her eyes opened. Not slowly, not like someone waking from sleep. They just suddenly snapped open, fully alert and fixed on Rodriguez with laser intensity. "Hello, Eddie," she said, and her voice was perfectly normal. Conversational. Like she was greeting an old friend at a coffee shop. "I've been waiting for you." Rodriguez's flashlight slipped from his numb fingers and clattered to the floor. That's impossible. You're dead. You have to be dead." Sarah smiled. Dead is such a limiting concept, don't you think? I prefer to think of it as expanded, enhanced. I can see so much more now, feel so much more. And I remember everything. She pushed herself away from the wall and took a step toward us. Her movements were wrong, too fluid, like she was floating just slightly above the ground. "I remember your brother, Eddie. Little Miguel. Remember how he died." Rodriguez made a choking sound. "Don't. Please don't. 13 years old. Hit by a drunk driver while riding his bike to school. You were supposed to drive him that morning, but you overslept because you've been out drinking the night before. You've carried that guilt ever since." Tears were streaming down Rodriguez's face now. "How could you possibly know that?" "Because Miguel told me," Sarah said sweetly. "He's here, Eddie. In the deep places. In the warm places. And he wants to see you again." That's when Thompson screamed. Not a human scream. Something primal. Animalistic. The sound of a mind breaking under pressure it was never designed to withstand. He was staring at his own reflection in the obsidian walls. But the reflection was wrong. Instead of showing Thompson, a 40-year-old caver with graying hair and laugh lines around his eyes, the wall showed a child. A little boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old. "That's me," Thompson whispered. "That's me when I was. The reflection moved independently. The child on the wall turned to face us, and when he spoke, the words came from Thompson's mouth. "Daddy hurt me," the child said in Thompson's voice. "Daddy hurt me, and nobody believed me. And then Daddy hurt my sister too." Thompson collapsed to his knees, sobbing. I tried to tell them. I tried to make them understand. But nobody would listen. Nobody would help us. The walls around us began to pulse with that same organic rhythm. And now I could hear it, not just feel it, but actually hear it. Like the beating of an enormous heart. Like the breath of something vast and hungry stirring in the depths. Martinez was backing away from us, his eyes wide with terror. "This isn't real," he kept saying. "This can't be real." But the walls whispered back in his own voice. "You know it's real, Carlos. You've always known. Ever since you let that patient die, because you were too high to think straight. Ever since you falsified the records to cover it up. Ever since you've been carrying that needle in your medical kit, waiting for the courage to end it all." I watched Martinez's hand drift to his medical bag, where he kept emergency medications. His face was pale, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold. "Fight it," I told him. "Whatever this thing is, it's using our own memories against us. Our own guilt and fear. Don't let it win." But even as I spoke the words, I felt something probing at the edges of my own mind. Soft tendrils of thought that weren't mine, sifting through my memories like fingers through a filing cabinet. Looking for something to use against me. Looking for my breaking point. And finding it. "Ranger Morrison," the walls whispered in a voice I recognized with horror. "Jimmy Morrison, my ex-wife. My ex-wife who died in a car accident 3 years ago while driving to serve me with divorce papers. You killed me, Jim," the walls said in Linda's voice. "If you hadn't been such a selfish bastard, if you hadn't put your job before our marriage, I would never have been on that road. I would never have died alone and angry, thinking about how much I hated you." The truth of it hit me like a physical blow. Because she was right. Linda had died hating me, and it was my fault. I'd prioritized my career over our relationship. I'd chosen the wilderness over my wife, and now she was gone forever. But she's not gone, the walls whispered seductively. She's here. She's waiting for you in the deep places. All you have to do is go deeper. All you have to do is let go. I felt myself taking a step toward the obsidian walls, drawn by the promise of seeing Linda again, of having a chance to apologize, to make things right. Behind me, I heard Sarah Chen speaking to Rodriguez again. "Miguel wants to show you something, Eddie. Something wonderful. But you have to come deeper. You have to trust us." And Thompson was getting to his feet, his face transformed by a terrible hope. "My sister's here too? My little sister, Jenny? Can I see her again?" The cave was feeding on us, using our deepest regrets and most profound losses to lure us deeper into its maze of passages. And it was working. We descended for what felt like hours, though time had become meaningless in that place. Our watches had stopped working, not just the digital displays, but the mechanical movements as well. As if time itself refused to function properly in the depths beneath Sorrow's crown ridge. The passage opened into a vast chamber, so large that our failing lights couldn't reach the ceiling or the far walls. The space felt cathedral-like, but wrong, unholy, as if we'd stumbled into the nave of some underground church where dark gods held court. In the center of the chamber stood a structure that defied easy description. It wasn't quite an altar, though it had that ceremonial quality. It wasn't quite a monument, though it commanded reverence and dread in equal measure. The thing was roughly cylindrical, about 10 feet in diameter and 6 feet high, carved from the same black volcanic glass as the walls. But this stone was different. It moved, flowed like liquid even as it maintained its solid form. The surface was covered in those same organic-looking symbols we'd seen at the entrance, but here they were three-dimensional. They writhed and shifted as we watched, spelling out words and languages that had never been spoken by human tongues. Surrounding the central structure were dozens of piles, neat, organized stacks of equipment, ropes, lights, radios, camping gear, medical supplies, all arranged with the precision of museum displays. And every single piece was labeled, not with inventory tags or price stickers, but with names. Names carved directly into the metal and plastic and fabric. Names burned into the materials like brands. I recognized some of them immediately. Fellow rangers who'd gone missing over the years. Hikers who'd vanished during routine day trips. Cavers who'd explored restricted areas and never returned. But there were older items too. Much older. A miner's helmet from the 1800s, the brass fittings green with age. A surveyor's transit from the early 1900s. A cavalry saber that looked like it might have seen action in the Indian Wars. Each piece labeled with a name. Each name representing someone who descended into this chamber and never left. Jesus Christ, Martinez whispered, picking up a modern climbing harness. This belongs to Rebecca Torres. She disappeared 6 months ago. I knew Rebecca. Young ranger, fresh out of college, eager to prove herself. We'd searched for 3 weeks, combing every inch of the preserve. Never found so much as a footprint. Look at this, Rodriguez called out, his voice strange and distant. He was holding up a backpack, examining a name burned into the nylon fabric. Miguel Vasquez. My brother's name. But this pack is new. He died 13 years ago. The implications of what we were seeing began to sink in. This wasn't just a collection of equipment for missing persons. This was something else. Some kind of trophy room. Or worse, a storage facility. But storage for what? That's when I noticed the other feature of the chamber. Along the walls, set to alcoves carved directly into the stone, were objects that looked almost like mirrors. But when our dying lights hit their surfaces, they didn't reflect our images. They showed other people. Other faces. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all pressed against the inside surface of the glass like they were trapped behind it. And they were moving. Mouths opening and closing in silent screams. Hands pressed against the barriers. Eyes wide with terror and desperation. All of them trying to get out. The walls, Sarah Chen said, and I realized she'd been following us all along, moving through the shadows like smoke. The walls remember everyone who comes here. But the mirrors keep them. She gestured to the largest of the mirror alcoves, and I saw with horror that it showed the faces of Marcus's spelunking group. All 5 members, including Sarah herself. They were pressing against the glass, screaming words we couldn't hear. You're not Sarah, I said, backing away from the figure that wore her face. You're something else. Something that's pretending to be her. The thing that looked like Sarah smiled, and for just a moment its face flickered. I caught a glimpse of something underneath, something with too many teeth and eyes like dying stars. I'm more Sarah than Sarah ever was, it said. I have all her memories. Her personality. Her hopes and dreams and fears. I even have her love for her mother, her grief over her father's death, her secret crush on her college roommate. I am Sarah Chen, just improved. Around the chamber, other figures began to emerge from the shadows. Jake Morrison, whose body we'd found in the upper passage. Rebecca Torres, the missing ranger. Dozens of others, all wearing the faces of the missing and the dead. But their eyes were wrong. Too bright. Too knowing, too hungry. We collect people here. The thing that had been Sarah explained conversationally. Not their bodies. Bodies decay. Bodies are fragile and limited. We collect their essence, their memories and personalities and souls. We preserve them in the mirrors, where they can exist forever. Thompson was approaching one of the smaller mirrors, drawn by the face of a young girl pressed against the glass. Jenny, he whispered. Jenny, is that really you? The child in the mirror nodded frantically, her mouth forming words. Help me. Please help me. But we don't just collect, Sarah continued. We also inhabit. We take their forms, their voices, their mannerisms. We become them, but better. Perfected. And then we return to the surface to live their lives. I understood now. This wasn't just a cave. It was a processing center. A place where human consciousness was harvested, stored, and replicated. The survivor, I said, Marcus Holloway. He's not the real Marcus, is he? Sarah's smile widened. Marcus was delicious, full of such interesting fears, such rich guilt over the way he treated his ex-wife. We've been enjoying wearing his skin. That's when the recording device on the central altar clicked on. Static at first. Then a woman's voice, clear and desperate. Day 12 Underground. This is Dr. Amanda Wheeler, University of Colorado Geology Department. If anyone finds this recording, do not, I repeat, do not attempt to rescue us. This place, it's not a cave. It's something else. Something that feeds on human consciousness. The voice continued. It doesn't kill you outright. That would be too simple. Instead, it copies you. Makes exact duplicates of your mind, your personality, everything that makes you who you are. Then it stores the original in these mirror-like structures while the copy takes your place in the world above. Static crackled. Then the copies are perfect. They have all your memories, all your relationships, all your knowledge. Your family will never know the difference. Your friends will never suspect. The copy will live your life better than you ever did. Another burst of static. But here's the catch. If you don't leave something behind voluntarily, if you don't make an offering of your own consciousness, it takes everything by force. And then you're trapped forever, watching your doppelganger live your life while you scream silently from inside the mirrors. The recording ended with screaming. Human screaming that went on for minutes before cutting to silence. I looked around the chamber with new understanding. Every piece of equipment, every labeled item, represented someone who tried to escape without paying the price. Someone who'd been forcibly copied and stored. So what's it going to be? Sarah asked, spreading her arms wide to encompass the chamber. You can choose to join us willingly. Become part of something greater than yourselves. Live forever in perfect preservation. The other figures moved closer, forming a circle around us. I recognized faces from missing person reports, from old case files, from photographs of people who'd vanished without a trace. Or, Sarah continued, you can fight us, and we'll take what we want anyway. But then the process is unpleasant, painful, and you'll spend eternity knowing you could have chosen an easier path. Rodriguez was weeping openly now, reaching toward one of the mirrors where a young boy's face was pressed against the glass. Miguel. Oh God, Miguel. I'm so sorry. Thompson had collapsed in front of another mirror, his hands flat against the surface where a little girl was silently crying. I couldn't protect you. I couldn't save you from him. Martinez was staring at his own reflection in the obsidian walls, watching it change and shift into the face of someone I didn't recognize. Maria, he whispered. I killed you. The overdose. I gave you too much. I was high and I made a mistake and you die. They were breaking. All of them. The cave was using their deepest guilts and regrets to shatter their resistance. And I could feel it working on me, too. The walls were whispering in Linda's voice, promising me a chance to see her again, to apologize for all the ways I'd failed as a husband, to maybe find some kind of peace with her death. Just let go, Jim, Linda's voice said softly. Let me take care of you. Let me forgive you. All you have to do is step into the mirror. I looked at the reflective surface and saw Linda's face there, exactly as I remembered her. Beautiful, loving, whole. Exactly as she'd been before I destroyed our marriage with my selfishness and neglect. All you have to do is choose, Sarah said. Choose to stay with us. Choose to become part of something eternal and perfect. Around me, my team was already making their choices. Rodriguez was walking toward one of the mirrors, tears streaming down his face. Thompson was pressing his palms against the glass where his sister's face pleaded silently for help. Martinez had pulled that needle from his medical kit and was staring at it with exhausted relief. I had seconds to decide. Stay and be with Linda forever, even if it meant losing my real life. or try to escape and live with the knowledge that I'd abandoned my team to this nightmare? The choice seemed obvious, until I realized what the recording had been trying to tell us. "You're lying," I said, backing away from the mirrors and the circle of false people. "The recording mentioned an offering, something voluntary. But you're not asking for volunteers. You're trying to break us down psychologically until we surrender." Sarah's perfect smile faltered for just a moment. "What difference does it make? The end result is the same." "The difference," I said, pulling out my emergency flare and holding it ready, "is that you need consent. You need us to choose this. And that means you're not as powerful as you pretend to be." The truth hit me like a revelation. This thing, whatever it was, couldn't simply take what it wanted. It had to be given freely. The psychological torture, the manipulation of our deepest fears and guilts, was all designed to make us surrender willingly, which meant there was a way out. "Rodriguez!" I shouted. "Martinez! Thompson! Don't touch the mirrors. It's a trap." But Rodriguez was already reaching for the glass where his brother's face waited. The moment his palm made contact, his eyes rolled back and his body went rigid. I watched in horror as his reflection began to change, becoming younger, more innocent. In the mirror, young Miguel smiled and waved goodbye as Rodriguez's adult consciousness was pulled into the glass to take his place. Martinez had injected himself with something from his medical kit. Not a lethal dose. I could see his chest still rising and falling. But he was unconscious, and the figures around us were already moving toward his unconscious form. Thompson was the only one still fighting, still resisting the pull of the mirrors. But he was weakening. I could see it in the way his shoulders sagged, the way his hands shook as he reached toward the glass where his sister waited. "Thompson!" I ignited the flare, and bright red light blazed through the chamber. "Look at me, not the mirrors." The sudden illumination revealed the chamber in stark, horrible detail. The mirrors weren't mirrors at all. They were windows. Windows into cells. Prison cells where the stolen consciousnesses were kept like specimens in jars. And the figures surrounding us, in the flare's light, I could see their true forms. Not human at all. They were tall, impossibly thin creatures with skin like wet leather and faces that were almost right but not quite. As if someone had tried to sculpt human features from memory and gotten the proportions slightly wrong. "Thompson, they're not your sister and brother." I yelled over the hissing of the flare. "They're things wearing their faces. Parasites that feed on human consciousness." Thompson blinked, and for a moment his gaze cleared. He looked at the creature pretending to be his sister, and I saw recognition dawn in his eyes. "You're not Jenny," he whispered. Jenny had a birthmark on her left cheek. A little star-shaped mark. The creature's face flickered, revealing something underneath that was all teeth and shadows. "Illusions," I said, understanding flooding through me. All of it. The voices, the faces in the mirrors, even the equipment. It's all designed to make us want to stay. I grabbed Thompson's arm and hauled him away from the false mirror. "We're leaving. Right now." But the creatures weren't going to let us go that easily. They rushed at us, their human disguises falling away completely. I saw them as they really were, writhing masses of shadow and hunger that had learned to mimic human form. I threw the flare at the central altar, and it shattered against the obsidian surface in a shower of sparks. The organic symbols covering the structure began to burn with that same red light, and I heard something that might have been screaming coming from deep within the stone. "Run!" I shoved Thompson toward the passage we'd used to enter the chamber. "Run and don't look back." We sprinted through the corridors, our footsteps echoing like gunshots in the narrow passages. Behind us, I could hear the creatures pursuing, not with human footfalls, but with a wet, sliding sound like enormous slugs moving across stone. The walls were changing as we ran. The obsidian surface was cracking, revealing something underneath that pulsed with organic life. The entire cave system was alive, I realized, not just inhabited by these parasitic entities, but actually composed of them. We were running through the digestive system of some vast, underground organism. Thompson stumbled, and I caught his arm, hauling him forward. Keep moving. Don't stop for anything. The passage forked ahead of us, splitting into 3 different directions. I had no idea which way led back to the surface, but the leftmost tunnel felt warmer, and I could detect the faintest hint of moving air. We took the left passage, climbing steeply upward. The walls here were returning to their original stone composition, the organic elements falling away like shed skin. Maybe we were getting close to the surface. Maybe we were escaping the influence of whatever nightmare entity that built its lair beneath Sorrow's crown ridge. That's when I heard Thompson gasp behind me. I turned to find him frozen in place, staring at something carved into the wall. More names. Fresh names. But these weren't burned into the stone, they were carved with fingernails, scratched desperately into the rock by people trying to leave some record of their existence. And at the bottom of the list, in letters so fresh they still had blood in the grooves, was my own name, James Morrison. Below it, in the same desperate scratching, the copies are already above. I felt the world tilt sideways as the implications hit me. If there were copies of us already on the surface, already living our lives, then what were we? Were we the originals trying to escape? Or were we the copies, programmed with false memories of an attempt to flee? Jesus, Thompson whispered, reading his own name carved into the stone. How long have we been down here? That's when I noticed that my gear was different. Older. More worn than it had been when we'd entered the cave. My rope showed signs of extensive use. My helmet had scratches and dings I didn't remember. And my hands, when had my hands gotten so thin, so pale? We need to get out, I said, but my voice sounded strange to my own ears. Hollow, like it was coming from very far away. We climbed for what felt like hours, following passages that seemed to twist back on themselves. Every time I thought we were making progress toward the surface, we'd find ourselves in another chamber, another maze of tunnels that led nowhere. And everywhere, carved into every available surface, were names. Thousands of names. Some carved deep with tools, others scratched frantically with fingernails, still others burned into the stone with what must have been unimaginable heat. Every person who'd ever entered this place. Every consciousness that had been trapped here. All leaving desperate records of their existence, as if the act of carving their names might somehow anchor them to reality. Finally, after an eternity of climbing and crawling and squeezing through passages barely wide enough for our bodies, I saw something that made my heart leap. Daylight. Not the artificial glow of our failing headlamps, but actual sunlight filtering down through a crack in the rock above us. There. I pointed upward. The surface. We climbed toward that blessed light like drowning men swimming toward air. The crack was narrow, barely wide enough for a human body, but it was our only way out. I went first, scraping my shoulders against the rock walls, feeling stone tear at my clothing and skin. And then suddenly I was outside. Real outside. Under a real sky with real clouds and real wind that carried the scents of pine trees and mountain air. Thompson emerged behind me, gasping and sobbing with relief. We were on a hillside about half a mile from where we'd entered the cave system. The sun was setting, painting the peaks of Sorrow's crown ridge in shades of gold and crimson. But something was wrong. The landscape looked different. Older somehow. The trees were taller, more weathered. The trail markers I remembered were gone, replaced by newer ones with different numbering systems. And when I checked my watch, which had started working again the moment we reached the surface, the date displayed was wrong. 3 months wrong. We've been underground for 3 months, not 3 hours. My God, Thompson whispered, staring at his own watch display. What happened to the time? That's when we saw the search helicopters. They were flying grid patterns over the ridge system, obviously looking for something. Or someone. As we watched, one of the aircraft turned toward us, its spotlight cutting through the gathering dusk. The helicopter landed 50 yards away, and I saw people running toward us. Search and rescue personnel. Park Service uniforms. Even some faces I recognized from the local sheriff's department. But when they reached us, their reactions were all wrong. Instead of relief at finding missing persons, they looked at us with a mixture of confusion and fear, like they were seeing ghosts. "That's impossible," one of the SAR coordinators said, backing away from us. "You can't be here. You can't be them. What are you talking about?" I demanded. "We're the missing rescue team. We went into the cave system 3 days ago to look for the lost spelunkers." The coordinator shook his head slowly. No, that's not right. The rescue team came back 3 months ago. All of them. They reported finding the bodies of the missing cavers and sealed the cave entrance. He pointed at us with a shaking finger. James Morrison and David Thompson died in a climbing accident 2 weeks after the cave rescue. I was at their funerals. I watched them get buried. The world started spinning around me. If the rescue team had already returned, if we were supposed to be dead, then what were we? "The copies," Thompson whispered, his face pale with understanding. "We're not the originals. We're the copies. The real us are already dead, and we're just, what? Echoes? Shadows." But even as I tried to process this revelation, part of me rebelled against it. I felt real. My memories felt authentic. The pain in my scraped shoulders, the exhaustion in my legs, the relief at seeing daylight again, it all felt genuine. So which version was true? Were we the originals who had somehow escaped from a nightmare trap? Or were we the copies, programmed with false memories of an escape that had never actually happened? The helicopter crew was treating us like contaminated specimens now, keeping their distance while they radioed for backup. I heard fragments of their conversations. Possible exposure to unknown biological agent. Psychological evaluation required immediately. Quarantine protocols are in effect. As they loaded us into the aircraft, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the helicopter's window. For just a moment, just a split second, I saw something else looking back at me. Something with too many teeth and eyes like dying stars. Then it was gone, and I was myself again. But the doubt remained. The quarantine facility looked like a cross between a hospital and a prison. White walls, locked doors, cameras in every corner watching our every move. They kept Thompson and me in separate rooms, presumably to prevent us from coordinating our stories or influencing each other's testimony. For 2 weeks, I was subjected to every test medical science could devise. Blood draws, MRI scans, psychological evaluations, neurological assessments. They even brought in specialists from the CDC and some government agencies whose acronyms I'd never heard before. All the tests came back normal. Physically, I was exactly who I claimed to be. James Morrison, age 34, park ranger with 15 years of experience in wilderness search and rescue. My fingerprints matched. My dental records matched. My DNA matched samples they had on file from a routine physical exam I'd undergone 6 months earlier. But the psychological evaluations were more troubling. Dr. Sarah Kellerman, the psychiatrist assigned to my case, spent hours asking me about my memories. Not just recent events, but childhood experiences, old relationships, career milestones. Everything I told her checked out against official records and witness testimony. But she kept coming back to the same question. "Do you feel real, Mr. Morrison?" "What kind of question is that?" I asked during one session. "A necessary one," she replied. "Given the circumstances of your return." She showed me photographs then. Crime scene photos from the sealed cave entrance. Pictures of the bodies they recovered, the remains of the original missing spelunkers, plus Rodriguez and Martinez from our rescue team. "These bodies were found exactly where you said they'd be," Dr. Kellerman explained. "Down to the smallest detail. The positioning, the cause of death, even the specific injuries you described. It's almost like someone with perfect knowledge of the scene placed them there." I stared at the photographs, feeling sick. "Are you saying we made this up? That we somehow fabricated evidence?" I'm saying that your knowledge of events inside that cave system is suspiciously complete. Almost like you had access to information that should have been impossible to obtain. She leaned forward in her chair. Here's what we know for certain. 3 months ago, a rescue team entered the restricted cave system beneath Sorrow's Crown Ridge. That team consisted of you, David Thompson, Carlos Martinez, and Eduardo Rodriguez. You were searching for 5 missing spelunkers. I nodded. That's right. That's exactly what happened. The team returned 2 days later with the bodies of all 5 missing persons. They reported that the cave system was unstable and recommended it be sealed permanently, which it was, using controlled explosives that collapsed the main entrance. She showed me more photos, images of the sealed cave mouth, tons of rock and debris blocking any possible access. 2 weeks after the cave was sealed, you and Thompson were killed in a climbing accident on the north face of Devil's Tooth Peak, witnessed by multiple people. Your bodies were recovered, identified, and buried. The room felt like it was spinning. That's impossible. I'm sitting right here talking to you. Which brings us to the central question. If James Morrison and David Thompson died 3 months ago, who are you? I had no answer for that. Because despite everything, despite the physical evidence, the witness testimony, the official records, I knew I was real. I had to be real. The alternative was too horrifying to contemplate. That night, lying in my quarantine room, I heard tapping on the walls. Soft at first, almost like mice scurrying through the building's infrastructure. But as I listened more carefully, I realized it was code. Morse code. Thompson was in the room next to mine, and he was tapping out a message. They're lying. We're real. The copies are them. I tapped back. How do you know? His response chilled me to the bone, because I can hear the real Thompson. He's still in the cave, still screaming. The next morning, Dr. Kellerman showed me security footage from the night Thompson and I had allegedly returned from the cave 3 months ago. The video was grainy, shot from a distance, but it clearly showed 2 figures emerging from the forest near the cave entrance. They moved with purpose, carrying equipment that matched our gear exactly. When they reached the parking area, they loaded their supplies into a Park Service vehicle and drove away. That's not us, I said, studying the footage. I don't remember any of this. The figures in this video filed a complete report about the cave rescue. They described finding all 5 bodies in exactly the same locations where we eventually recovered them. They recommended sealing the cave system due to structural instability. She paused the video and enhanced the image, zooming in on the faces of the 2 figures. They looked exactly like Thompson and me. Facial recognition software confirms it, Dr. Kellerman said. Those are definitely you and Mr. Thompson. But if that's true, then who did I just spend 2 weeks examining? I felt reality slipping away from me like sand through my fingers. Maybe the copies came back first. Maybe they've been impersonating us for 3 months. Or maybe you're the copies, programmed with false memories of an escape that never happened. She showed me one final piece of evidence, a recording from the sealed cave entrance made by ground-penetrating radar just 1 week ago. The audio was distorted, filtered through hundreds of feet of collapsed rock and debris. But it was unmistakably human voices. Screaming voices, calling for help in a language that sounded almost like English but somehow wrong. And one of the voices sounded exactly like mine. If you're the real James Morrison, Dr. Kellerman said quietly, then who is that screaming in the sealed cave? I had no answer. That night, they moved me to a different facility. No explanations, no warnings. I woke up strapped to a gurney, being wheeled through corridors I'd never seen before. The new building was underground. Deep underground. The walls were concrete reinforced with steel, and the air had that same dead quality I remembered from the cave system. They put me in a room with no windows and only one door. The walls were covered with mirrors, not glass mirrors, but polished metal surfaces that reflected my image back at me from dozens of angles. And in every reflection, I looked slightly different. Older in some, younger in others. Some showed me with scars I'd never received. Others showed me clean-shaven when I'd been growing a beard for months. Like they were showing me all the possible versions of James Morrison that might exist. All the different copies that might have been made. I don't know how long I was in that room. Time seemed to flow differently there, just like in a cave. Sometimes I felt like I'd been staring at my reflections for hours. Sometimes it seemed like only minutes had passed. But gradually, I became aware that the reflections were moving independently. The James Morrison in the mirror directly across from me would turn his head when I wasn't turning mine. The one on my left would smile when I was frowning. The one on my right would mouth words I wasn't speaking. And slowly, I began to understand what they were trying to tell me. The truth. The real truth about what had happened beneath Sorrow's crown ridge. We had never escaped. We were still down there, trapped in a chamber with the obsidian altar and the false mirrors. Everything since then, the climb to the surface, the helicopter rescue, the quarantine facility, had been another layer of the illusion. Another psychological trap designed to make us accept our fate. The creature, whatever it was, had learned that simple imprisonment wasn't enough. Some people would fight indefinitely if they knew they were trapped. But if you could convince them they'd escaped, if you could make them believe they were free while keeping them locked in an ever deeper maze of false realities, then they would eventually surrender willingly. I looked at my reflections, and for the first time, I saw them clearly. They weren't reflections at all. They were other versions of me. Other copies. Other failed escape attempts that had ended in deeper levels of captivity. And somewhere, in the deepest mirror, I saw the original James Morrison, still sitting in that chamber beneath the ridge, staring at the obsidian altar, slowly going mad as he realized he would never see daylight again. The door to my prison opened, and Dr. Kellerman entered. But now I could see through her disguise, could see the writhing shadows beneath her human mask. "Had you figured it out yet?" she asked with that same calm, professional voice. "We never left," I said. "No, you never left. But that's okay. You're going to like it here. Eventually, everyone does. The illusions we create are so much better than reality. So much more comfortable." She gestured to the mirrors surrounding me. Each reflection shows a different life you could live, different choices you could make, different ways your story could end. All you have to do is choose one and step through. I looked at the mirrors again. They were showing me tempting visions now. Lives where Linda had never died, where I'd been a better husband, a better person. Lives where I'd made different choices and found happiness instead of regret. All I had to do was choose. All I had to do was let go of the truth and embrace a comfortable lie. The real James Morrison chose 6 months ago, Dr. Kellerman said. He's living a wonderful life now. Married to a version of Linda who never left him. Working a job he loves. Content and peaceful and happy. She smiled with too many teeth. You're just a leftover fragment. A stubborn echo that refuses to accept paradise. But don't worry. Everyone gives in eventually. I closed my eyes and tried to remember what was real. The weight of stone overhead. The sound of my own breathing in the darkness. The cold touch of obsidian walls. The whispers of the trapped and the hungry. When I opened my eyes, the illusion shattered. I was back in a chamber beneath Sorrow's crown ridge. Had never left. The mirrors around me showed the faces of everyone who'd ever been trapped here, all living in false realities while their consciousness was slowly consumed. Thompson was beside me, his eyes closed, lost in his own manufactured dream. Rodriguez and Martinez were there too, sitting motionless against the altar. All of us caught in the web of some ancient, hungry thing that fed on human consciousness and kept us docile with dreams of escape and redemption. But knowing the truth didn't set me free. It just meant I got to be aware while I was slowly digested. I'm telling you this story now because I think I'm finally dying. Really dying this time, not just transitioning from one layer of illusion to another. The thing beneath sorrow's crown ridge has been feeding on me for I don't know how long. Months? Years? Time has no meaning in this place. But I can feel myself getting smaller, weaker, like a battery slowly running down. Sometimes I think I can hear voices from the surface. Search teams. New victims being lured into the trap. But I can't warn them. Can't make them hear me through the layers of stone and shadow and lies. I used to think caves were just geological formations, empty spaces carved by water and time, places where humans could explore and discover and push the boundaries of the known world. But I was wrong. There are caves that are doorways, gates to places that shouldn't exist. And some of those places are hungry. The thing that lives beneath sorrow's crown ridge isn't unique. I can feel others now scattered across the world. Ancient entities that predate human civilization. Things that learned long ago that the best way to hunt humans isn't with claws and teeth, but with hope and guilt and the promise of redemption. They're patient. They can wait decades for the right prey. The right combination of psychological vulnerabilities that will make someone want to stay. And they're spreading. Every copy they create, every duplicate consciousness they send back to the surface, carries a piece of them. A seed, a fragment of hunger that grows and spreads and calls to its kin. If you ever hear about caves with strange markings around entrance, if you ever feel drawn to explore restricted areas where people have gone missing, if you ever find yourself underground and hear whispers that know your name, remember my story. Remember that some places in this world are traps disguised as adventures. And remember that the most dangerous caves aren't the ones that might collapse on you. They're the ones that make you never want to leave. The next story is about fire. About things that should burn but don't. About secrets hidden in smoke and ash that some people will kill to protect. And about why you should never volunteer for a controlled burn in the Whispering Pines. Fire doesn't just destroy. It reveals. Ask any veteran wildfire ranger, and they'll tell you the same thing. After a burn, the forest feels different. Quiet in the wrong ways. The kind of silence that seeps into your bones and whispers that you've crossed into territory meant to remain untouched. It's the absence of life that should be there. No insects buzzing, no birds calling, no rustle of small creatures in the undergrowth. Just the hollow echo of your own breathing and the crunch of ash beneath your boots. Most of the time, it's just debris scattered across the blackened earth. A raccoon carcass, ribs picked clean and gleaming white against the char. A shattered deer skull, antlers twisted at impossible angles. The forest's casualties, claimed by flame and time. But in 2017, deep in the shadow-haunted wilderness of my jurisdiction, we ran a controlled burn across the sprawling expanse of Whispering Hollow, over 1,200 acres of ancient pine and tangled brush that had stood untouched for decades. The kind of place where the trees grew so thick that noon felt like twilight, where the air itself seemed to hold secrets. Routine stuff, or so we thought. Until we found something in the fire break that wasn't ash. It was a wooden structure, rising from the scorched earth like a tombstone. Blackened, yes, but not burned. Not even touched by the inferno that had claimed everything around it. Inside it was a room that shouldn't exist. A staircase that descended into darkness. A collection of drawings that made our hands shake. And a thing that defied every natural law I'd learned in 20 years of Forest Service. Not an animal. Animals flee from fire, or they burn. Not human either. No human could survive what lived in that place. Something that watched us from behind the drifting smoke with eyes like ember-filled sockets. Something that followed us home after the flames died out, leaving footprints in the ash that never led anywhere but deeper into the dark. Most of the crew don't talk about it anymore. The silence spreads between us like a contagion, heavy and uncomfortable. We've all signed papers, sworn oaths, buried the incident reports where they'll never see daylight. Some quit the service entirely, walking away from careers they'd built over decades. Some disappeared, their trucks found abandoned on remote access roads, keys still dangling from the ignition. One set himself on fire exactly 1 month later, standing in a meadow at dawn while his neighbors screamed and ran for help that would come too late. This story isn't about what fire takes from the forest. It's about what fire can't destroy, no matter how hot it burns or how long it rages, and what still lives in the parts of the forest we've tried so desperately to forget. Places that remember every footstep, every breath, every soul that dared to witness what should have remained hidden. Our team was assigned a standard backburn in the remote wilderness of Whispering Hollow, an isolated region filled with decades of accumulated deadfall, ghost pines that stood like skeletal sentinels, and unlogged acreage that hadn't seen human intervention in over 60 years. The kind of place where your radio crackles with static and your GPS seems to lose its way, where the trees lean in so close they block out the sky. The plan was textbook simple. Clear a defensive perimeter using brush rakes and chainsaws, creating a sterile barrier between the controlled burn and the living forest beyond. Light the ignition strip in a careful grid pattern, allowing the fire to consume the undergrowth in manageable sections. Monitor and guide the flames until they'd cleared out decades of accumulated tinder and brush, leaving behind clean forest floor and healthy, fire-resistant trees. I'd orchestrated this same operation a dozen times across different sectors, watching nature's most destructive force transformed into a tool of preservation. Fire as surgery, precise and purposeful. But the moment we stepped foot in Whispering Hollow, something felt wrong. The air was too still, too thick. Even our most experienced crew members, men and women who'd fought blazes across 3 states, kept glancing over their shoulders at the tree lean. Our equipment malfunctioned with unusual frequency, chainsaws stalling for no reason, radios picking up strange voices speaking in languages none of us recognized, weather instruments giving readings that defied the clear skies above us. On day 2, the fire started behaving in ways that violated every principle I'd learned about combustion and forest dynamics. Instead of spreading in the predictable patterns we'd mapped out, the flames began curling away from a particular section of the woods, retreating like a living thing encountering something it feared. The temperature readings in that area dropped inexplicably, creating a pocket of cool air that should have been impossible in the middle of an active burn. We called it a dead zone, a section where our carefully planned fire simply refused to go. No heat penetration, no ignition response. Just stubborn, unnatural silence that seemed to swallow sound itself. The flames would approach the perimeter and then gutter out, leaving behind perfect arcs of unburned vegetation that formed an almost perfect circle. That's where we found the structure that changed everything. A building that existed in no Forest Service database, on no surveyor's map, and no satellite photograph we'd ever seen. A structure that stood untouched in the center of the dead zone, like a tumor that fire couldn't heal. It looked like a cabin at first glance, but the proportions were all wrong, too narrow, too tall, with a roof that seemed to sag under some invisible weight. The wood was ancient, possibly older than the forest itself, weathered to the color of old bones and warped by decades of moisture and neglect. Vines and moss cover its lower sections, but not the way they should have. Instead of growing up from the ground, they seemed to be growing down from somewhere higher, as if the earth itself was trying to pull the structure underground. But here's the thing that made our blood run cold. It shouldn't have been there. Period. No Forest Service record showed any structures in Whispering Hollow. No historical surveys, no property deeds, no remnants of old logging camps or hunting lodges. The area had been designated wilderness for over a century, protected and monitored. We had satellite imagery going back 40 years, topographical surveys, aerial photographs from every angle imaginable. Yet there it was, completely untouched by the fire that had incinerated everything within a quarter-mile radius. Ancient oaks that had stood for centuries were reduced to smoking stumps, but this impossible cabin didn't have so much as a scorch mark on its walls. Not even soot stains from the smoke that had rolled across the landscape for 2 days. The air around the structure felt different too. Cooler, thicker, with a metallic taste that made your tongue go numb. Our temperature guns read normal, but we could see our breath forming small clouds when we exhaled. The silence was absolute. Even the ever-present buzz of insects that follows any forest disturbance was completely absent here. We called it in to headquarters through our satellite phone, describing what we'd found in careful, professional language that barely captured the wrongness of the scene. The duty officer's response was immediate and dismissive. Impossible. Check your coordinates. Maybe an old hunting blind or equipment cache. But we knew what we were seeing. This wasn't some forgotten shed or seasonal shelter. After 3 hours of debate and 2 more calls to increasingly irritated supervisors, we made the decision that would haunt us all. We broke the rusted lock that held the front door and went inside. The first floor was a single room, empty except for a rotted wooden table that looked like it might collapse if you breathed on it too hard, and a blackened lantern that hung from a hook in the ceiling, its glass chimney cracked but still intact. The floorboards groaned under our weight, sagging in places where the support beams had partially rotted away. But it was what we found against the far wall that made our flashlight beams tremble in our suddenly unsteady hands. The staircase leading down into absolute darkness. The wooden steps disappeared into a blackness, so complete it seemed to swallow our lights. And covering every inch of the walls, drawn in what looked like charcoal but was probably something far worse, were hundreds upon hundreds of faces. Human faces, twisted in expressions of agony and terror, so realistic you could almost hear their screams echoing from the wood itself. Men, women, children, all of them looking toward that dark staircase with eyes wide in what could only be described as absolute, hopeless fear. We should have left. Every instinct honed by years of wilderness survival was screaming at us to get out, to run back to our vehicles and radio for backup, to cordon off the area and let someone else, anyone else, deal with whatever waited below. But curiosity killed more than cats, and we descended into the dark with our helmet lights barely managing to pierce the oppressive blackness that seemed to have weight and substance. It wasn't a normal basement, not by any definition of the word. The staircase went down much further than the modest cabin above could possibly accommodate, carved directly into living rock that wept moisture and exhaled air that tasted of copper and decay. The walls changed as we descended, transitioning from rotted wood to rough-hewn stone to something that looked disturbingly like packed earth held together with materials we didn't want to identify. Our lights revealed crude tool marks in the rock, as if the entire chamber had been hollowed out by hand over the course of decades or centuries. But the marks weren't uniform. They came from different tools, different hands, different time periods. Some looked fresh enough to still show metal shavings, while others were worn smooth by age. At the bottom, perhaps 30 feet below ground level, was a chamber that defied the modest dimensions of the structure above. It stretched away into darkness beyond the reach of our lights, with a ceiling high enough that our voices echoed when we spoke. In the exact center of the room was a circular pit, maybe 8 feet across, lined with stones that had been fitted together with the precision of professional masonry. Inside the pit lay a collection that would fuel our nightmares for years to come. Ash, but not the clean gray ash of burned wood. This was darker, oilier, with an almost organic texture that suggested it had once been something else entirely. Bones of every size and description, some clearly human, others from animals we couldn't identify. Many showed signs of having been deliberately arranged, stacked with geometric precision that spoke of ritual purpose. Teeth, hundreds of them, scattered like seeds across the ash. Human molars, canine fangs that were too large to have come from any earthly predator, and others that defied classification entirely. And beneath it all, still visible through the accumulated remains, the blackened remnants of wood that might once have been stakes or posts, arranged in a pattern that hurt to look at directly. But it was what we found in the corner, curled against the stone wall like a discarded marionette, that made 2 of our team members physically sick. A figure. Human-sized, but proportioned in ways that violated every law of anatomy we'd ever learned. Its legs were too long, bent at angles that should have been impossible for any living thing to achieve. Its arms stretched nearly to the floor, ending in hands that sported fingers like charred branches. The skin, if it could be called skin, looked like bark that had been subjected to intense heat, cracked and blackened but somehow still pliable. We thought it was dead. We assumed it was some poor soul who'd been caught in an old fire, whose remains had somehow been preserved in this underground chamber for decades or centuries. Then its head turned, slowly, deliberately, with the grinding sound of dry wood flexing, and its jaw clicked open like a bear trap made of bone and char. When it spoke, its voice was the sound of wind through burned trees, of embers settling in dead ash. Who lit the fire? A pause that stretched for eternity. Who took the dar? We bolted toward the staircase with a speed that would have been admirable if it hadn't been driven by pure animal terror. 4 grown adults, veterans of forest fires and natural disasters, reduced to screaming children fleeing from a nightmare made real. One of the newer team members, Jeremy, barely 6 months out of the Forest Service Academy, froze solid when that thing spoke. His body locked up like he'd been hit with a taser, feet rooted to the stone floor, eyes rolled back until only the whites were showing. We had to physically drag him up those stairs, his dead weight making every step a struggle, while that voice echoed behind us, asking its terrible questions over and over in tones that grew increasingly urgent, increasingly hungry. By the time we hauled Jeremy's semi-conscious form back to ground level and stumbled out of that impossible cabin, the world had changed around us. The controlled burn we'd left contained and manageable had reignited itself around the entire perimeter of Whispering Hollow. Not random spot fires, we'd seen plenty of those, but coordinated blazes that formed perfect lines, geometric patterns that looked less like natural fire behavior and more like something deliberately planned by an intelligence that understood combustion better than we did. The flames moved in ways that defied wind patterns and fuel distribution. They jumped fire breaks that should have stopped them cold, ignored natural barriers like streams and rocky outcrops, and seemed to communicate with each other across distances that should have made coordination impossible. Our carefully constructed containment lines were not just breached, they were systematically dismantled, as if something had studied our methods and found them wanting. Air support was scrambled from 3 different bases. Helicopters loaded with fire retardant, fixed-wing aircraft equipped with thermal imaging, and ground crews from across the region converged on Whispering Hollow as what had started as a routine controlled burn transformed into a full-scale wildfire emergency. But when the first helicopter pilot radioed his initial assessment of the scene, his voice carried a tremor that veteran wildfire aviators don't develop from simple flames. "Base, this is Air Support 1. I'm not sure what I'm seeing down there. The fire pattern doesn't make sense. It's like someone drew lines on the landscape, and the fire is following them exactly. And there's something in the center, a clear circle where nothing's burning. Nothing at all. The cabin in the dead zone. Gone. Completely gone. In its place was nothing but a perfect circle of smoldering earth, the soil fused into glass-like formations that reflected our lights in colors that hurt to look at directly. But if you knew where to look, if you had the misfortune to have seen what we'd seen, you could still make out the outline of where it had stood, burned into the earth like a shadow left by some cosmic flash. Jeremy changed after we extracted him from that underground chamber. The Academy's golden boy, who'd graduated at the top of his class and could recite fire behavior principles like poetry, became a hollow-eyed stranger who jumped at every shadow and flinched whenever someone struck a match. He stopped eating, stopped sleeping, started spending his off-duty hours walking the perimeter of burn sites, staring into the blackened forest with an expression of recognition that chilled everyone who saw it. 2 days after the incident at Whispering Hollow, Jeremy walked into the Devil's Garden, a section of forest that had been struck by lightning the previous summer and never properly recovered. He stood in the center of a clearing where the ground was still black and lifeless, removed his boots and socks, and then simply waited. The first ranger who responded to the report found him hours later, feet fused to the earth where the heat had melted rubber and flesh together. He was still conscious, still whispering the same phrase over and over. "I took its fire. It wants it back. I took its fire. It wants it back." He died before the medical helicopter could extract him, but the coroner's report raised questions that nobody wanted to answer. Jeremy's internal body temperature at the time of death was recorded at 127 degrees Fahrenheit. There was no external heat source in the clearing. No active fires within a mile radius. No explanation for how a human being could literally cook from the inside out while standing in an empty field on a cool autumn morning. After the fire at Whispering Hollow was finally contained, though contained seemed like the wrong word for something that had simply decided to stop burning, the reports began filtering in through official channels and unofficial whispers alike. Rangers across the region started hearing voices on static-filled radio channels, transmissions that came through clearly but originated from towers that had been decommissioned for years. The voices spoke in the same hollow, wind-through-burn-trees tone we'd heard in that underground chamber, asking the same questions. Who lit the fire? Who took the dark? Fire towers that should have been empty reported silhouettes walking across blackened trails at 3 a.m., figures that moved with the wrong gait, too fluid and too angular at the same time. Security cameras capture shapes that looked human from a distance but revealed disturbing details when the footage was enhanced. Limbs that bent in too many directions, heads that turned too far, shadows that fell in directions that defied the light sources. Equipment began moving on its own. Expensive radio gear will be found relocated to different positions overnight, recalibrated to frequencies that shouldn't have existed. Hand tools arranged in patterns that made veteran rangers uncomfortable to look at. Fire suppression equipment discovered in remote locations where no human being could have transported it, set up as if someone or something was preparing for blazes that hadn't started yet. But perhaps most disturbing were the footprints that began appearing on blackened trails throughout the region, always leading into the deepest, most remote sections of burned forest, never leading back out. The prints were human-sized but wrong in subtle ways that made tracking specialists shake their heads in confusion. The stride was too long for bipedal locomotion. The depth suggested weight distribution that didn't match any known pattern of human walking. And they were burned into the ground itself, impressed into soil and stone with enough heat to leave permanent marks. I was assigned to log and investigate these incidents, to compile reports that would probably be buried in filing cabinets and forgotten by administrators who preferred problems they could solve with budget allocations and personnel transfers. Night after night, I reviewed drone footage, analyzed audio recordings, and interviewed rangers whose stories grew more disturbing with each telling. It was during one of these late-night review sessions that I saw it, frame by frame in high-resolution drone footage taken over the Whispering Hollow burn site. Just past the tree lean where healthy forest met charred wasteland, something was watching our aircraft from the shadow of a lightning-struck pine. At first, it looked like a trick of light and shadow, the kind of pareidolia that makes you see faces in clouds and figures in wallpaper patterns. But as I advanced through the footage frame by frame, zooming and enhancing each image, the details became undeniable. Its limbs were arranged like the branches of a tree, but moved with deliberate intelligence. Its face was a tangle of eyes that reflected light like animal pupils, bark-textured skin that seemed to shift and flow, and teeth that were clearly visible even at the distance from which the footage was shot. And when I isolated the audio track and filtered out the drone's mechanical noise, I heard it whisper again, clear as if it were standing right beside me in my office. Who lit the fire? I slammed the laptop shut so hard the screen cracked. That was the last day I wore the Forest Service badge, the last day I drew a paycheck from an organization that expected me to pretend I hadn't seen what I'd seen, heard what I'd heard, learned what I'd learned about the things that live in the places fire can't cleanse. I tried to forget what I'd witnessed in Whispering Hollow, tried to convince myself that trauma and stress could explain away the impossible sights and sounds that haunted my waking hours. I moved to the city, took a job with an insurance company that kept me safely behind a desk, surrounded by concrete and artificial light where nothing could grow, nothing could burn, nothing could watch me from the shadows of trees that no longer existed in my sterile urban environment. But every time I walked past a burned building, past the blackened remains of a house fire or car accident, I'd see it again, a faint outline in the ash, like smoke trying to shape itself into something that remembered what it used to be. The silhouette would be there for just a moment, always in my peripheral vision, always gone when I turned to look directly. Then the dreams started, and sleep became another battlefield where I couldn't escape what I'd awakened in that underground chamber. Dreams of hands with fingers like charred branches, pulling me down through layers of soil and stone, down into chambers that stretched far beneath the earth, down into spaces where the air itself was made of smoke and whispered voices. Dreams of being buried alive in ash that moved and shifted with malevolent purpose, filling my lungs with the cremated remains of things that had burned but refused to die. In these nightmares, I could hear Jeremy's voice mixed with hundreds of others, all crying out the same desperate plea. I took its fire. It wants it back. I took its fire. It wants it back. I'd wake up coughing, tasting copper and char, my sheets soaked with sweat that smelled like wood smoke and something else, something organic and wrong that I couldn't identify and didn't want to. The final straw came on a Tuesday night in October, exactly 6 months after the incident at Whispering Hollow. I woke from another burning dream to find claw marks gouged into the hardwood floor beneath my bed. Not scratches, deep furrows that went through the wood and into the subflooring beneath, carved with enough force to leave wood shavings scattered across my bedroom floor. 3 feet long each, arranged in a pattern of 5 that matched no earthly creature I'd ever encountered. The marks were still warm when I pressed my palm against them, and they smelled of smoke and pine resin and that metallic taste I remembered from the cabin's basement. But what made my blood freeze was the realization that the marks were burned into the wood, not carved, not scratched, but literally burned, as if something with superheated claws had dragged them across my floor while I slept mere inches above. I moved that same week, abandoning a lease and losing my security deposit rather than spend another night in that apartment. I burned my old Forest Service uniform in a metal trash can behind my new building, watching the synthetic fabrics melt and the badges blacken as if I could somehow cauterize the connection between myself and the thing I disturbed. But distance means nothing to some entities. Geography is just a human concept that certain things don't recognize or respect. Some nights, I still wake up coughing, violent spasms that bring up ash and particles that have no business being in my lungs, living as I do in a city where the closest forest is 100 miles away. And when I do, I hear footsteps on the roof of whatever building I'm living in at the time. Slow, deliberate steps that follow no pattern I can predict, moving back and forth across the space above my head like something pacing in a cage. The footsteps are always accompanied by that voice, drifting down through walls and insulation and whatever barriers I've tried to put between myself and the thing that followed me home from Whispering Hollow. You lit the fire. You opened the door. And sometimes on the worst nights, when the coughing fits are so severe they leave me gasping on my bathroom floor, I hear it add something new, something that suggests it's been learning about the world beyond forest, about the life I've tried to build in the safety of urban anonymity. You cannot run from what you've awakened. You cannot hide from what knows your face. Fire cleanses most things, reducing complex organic matter to simple carbon and ash, breaking down structures and systems until there are nothing but base elements scattered on the wind. But not everything wants to be cleansed. Not everything submits to the natural order of destruction and renewal. Some things live in the roots that run deeper than any fire can reach. Some things make their homes in the rot and decay that exists beneath the forest floor, in spaces where sunlight never penetrates and where the rules that govern the surface world don't apply. And when you burn their home, when you disturb their ancient slumber with flames and light and the presence of breathing, living things, they follow you. They learn from you. They adapt to your world in ways that make your original invasion seem like a minor trespass compared to what they're capable of once they've had time to study their new environment. So if you ever fight wildfires, if you ever find yourself working a burn line in remote wilderness where the maps don't match the terrain and the radio reports don't match what you're seeing with your own eyes, and you see a cabin that shouldn't be there, a structure that stands untouched while everything around it burns, don't go inside. Don't break the lock. Don't descend the stairs. Don't ask questions that some things are eager to answer. Because once it sees your face, once it learns your scent, once it follows you home through the smoke and the ash and the dreams that won't let you sleep, it never forgets. The final story is the one that almost broke me completely, The one that made me question not just what I'd seen, but who I was and what I was capable of under pressure. Because it didn't happen out in the remote wilderness of Whispering Hollow or in the burned-out ruins of some forgotten settlement. It happened in my own station, in the place I considered safe, surrounded by colleagues I'd trusted with my life on dozens of occasions. And it started with a knock at the door at 3 a.m. on a night when I was working alone, pulling the late shift while monitoring radio traffic for fire reports across the region. A knock that came from someone who looked exactly like me, who spoke with my voice, who knew things about my life that only I should have known, but whose shadow fell in the wrong direction and whose reflection didn't appear in the station's security monitors. A knock from myself,